Let's settle in for a story tonight. We are going far back, to a land of golden sands and a brilliant blue river, to a time of gods and monuments. We are going to ancient Egypt, a place we think we know so well. Picture the pharaoh. The image is one of absolute power, a living god, draped in gold, sitting on a throne, with thousands ready to obey a single command. It seems like the best job in the ancient world, a life of pure, unquestioned luxury. But that image is a beautiful illusion. The reality of being a pharaoh was a crushing, terrifying responsibility. It was a daily routine that would absolutely break most of us, a constant struggle against chaos, where the stakes were the survival of an entire civilization. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the noise of the day fade away. Forget the golden mask and the powerful poses you've seen in museums, and let's ease into tonight's journey together to understand the true weight of the Egyptian crown. Our story begins not with a person, but with a river, the Nile. In Egypt, the Nile was everything. It was the source of all life, the clock that set the rhythm of the year, and the foundation of the entire kingdom. Without it, there was only desert. On paper, the pharaoh's relationship with this river seemed simple. The gods loved the pharaoh, so the gods made the river flood its banks each year. This flood brought rich, dark soil, allowing crops to grow and the people to eat. It was a perfect, reliable system. Here's the terrifying truth. The pharaoh was held personally responsible for that flood. If the flood was too low, the land would starve. If the flood was too high, entire villages would be washed away, taking people and livestock with them. Both were seen as the pharaoh's fault. This wasn't just a political problem like a modern leader facing a bad economy. It was seen as a personal, cosmic failure. The gods were clearly displeased with the pharaoh. It was a sign that the ruler was weak, unworthy, or had somehow broken their divine contract. Imagine the anxiety. Every year, priests would watch the Nilometers, special structures built to measure the water level. The reports sent to the palace weren't just data. They were a divine judgment on the pharaoh's rule. The pressure must have been unbearable. Every whisper of a poor harvest, every hungry child, was a direct accusation against the person on the throne. The pharaoh was not just a king, they were the single point of contact for the gods. If that connection failed, everyone suffered the consequences of that failure. This single responsibility frames the job perfectly. Being pharaoh wasn't about enjoying power. It was about carrying the weight of ensuring the sun would rise, the river would flood, and the crops would grow. It was an impossible burden, year after year. So while the people might be celebrating a perfect flood, the pharaoh was likely just breathing a sigh of relief. They had survived another cosmic performance review, but they knew, with absolute certainty, that another one was just 1 year away. But the pressure didn't stop at the water's edge. This constant stress was tied to a concept that governed all of Egyptian life, a single word that held the universe together. That word was Ma'at, and it was the pharaoh's second great burden. Ma'at is often translated as harmony, justice, and truth. It was the natural, perfect order of the cosmos. The Egyptians believed the universe was created in a state of perfect balance, and their entire society was designed to maintain it and keep chaos at bay. The idealized version of this is that the pharaoh, as a god on earth, was the living embodiment of Ma'at. Their very existence maintained the cosmic order. They were the anchor that kept the world from spinning into darkness and chaos. The reality was far more demanding. The pharaoh didn't just embody Ma'at, they had to actively create and enforce it every single day. Every law passed, every temple built, every battle fought was an act meant to reinforce this cosmic balance. Think of it this way. Any negative event was a sign that Ma'at was weakening. A military defeat? The pharaoh had failed to maintain order. A plague sweeping through a city? The pharaoh's connection to the gods was faltering. A sandstorm that ruined crops? A tear in the fabric of cosmic harmony. This meant the pharaoh was living on a razor's edge. They couldn't have a bad day. They couldn't make a poor decision. Every action was judged not by its political outcome, but by its cosmic one. It was a job with no room for human error. It was less like being a king, and more like being the universe's primary maintenance worker. If a light bulb went out anywhere in the kingdom, it was the pharaoh's job to climb the ladder and fix it, all while the entire world watched. This constant need to project divine order leads us to the pharaoh's daily schedule. If you imagine them lounging around, being fed grapes and fanned by servants, you'd be deeply mistaken. The reality was far more rigid and, frankly, exhausting. The pharaoh was the chief priest for every single god in the Egyptian pantheon, and there were hundreds of them. Each god had their own cult, their own temples, and their own specific set of rituals that had to be performed perfectly to keep them happy. On paper, the pharaoh could delegate these duties to local priests. But in theory, it was the pharaoh themselves who was supposed to be in every temple, every single day, performing these sacred rites. The priests were just their stand-ins. The day began before dawn with purification rituals. The pharaoh was washed, anointed with oils, and dressed in sacred garments. This wasn't about looking good. It was about being made pure enough to enter the presence of the gods on behalf of all of humanity. From there, the day was a relentless series of ceremonies. They would have to make offerings, recite ancient hymns, and perform symbolic acts. Every word, every gesture had to be perfect. A mistake could anger a god and, by extension, disrupt Ma'at. This wasn't a creative or inspiring job. It was deeply repetitive. The same hymns, the same offerings, day after day, year after year. It was a gilded cage of religious obligation, designed to subordinate the pharaoh's personal will to the needs of the cosmos. Imagine the mental fatigue. You are not a person anymore. You are a vessel, a tool for maintaining divine relationships. Your personal feelings, your health, your desires, none of it mattered. The rituals were what was real, and they were never ending. The pharaoh couldn't simply take a day off because they were feeling unwell. To do so would be to neglect a god, to risk cosmic imbalance. They were prisoners to their own divinity, trapped in an endless cycle of ceremony. Beyond the temple walls, another critical part of their job awaited. The pharaoh was not just a priest, they were also the commander-in-chief, and this was not a symbolic title. They were expected to be a warrior. The great temple walls of Egypt are covered in images of pharaohs as mighty conquerors. We see them in their chariots, single-handedly defeating entire armies. They are depicted as superhuman figures, untouchable and invincible, the perfect warrior. It's easy to dismiss these images as simple propaganda, a way to project strength. And while there was certainly an element of that, the expectation was very real. When Egypt went to war, the pharaoh was often expected to lead the army in person. This was not a safe position in the back of the formation. The pharaoh was expected to be on the front lines, to be seen by their troops and by the enemy. Their presence was a living symbol of Egypt's power and divine favor. This put them in incredible physical danger. An arrow, a spear, or a simple accident with a chariot could end the life of a living god. The stability of the entire nation rested on the pharaoh's ability to survive the chaos of a real, bloody battlefield. Consider the famous Battle of Kadesh, fought by Ramesses the Great. According to his own account, he was separated from his main army and surrounded by enemy chariots. He had to personally fight his way out of a trap that nearly cost him his life. This wasn't an exaggeration for the history books. It was the brutal reality of the job. You were a living god one day, and the next you were in the mud and dust, fighting for your life, just like any common soldier. The pressure was twofold. First, you had to win. A defeat wasn't just a strategic loss. It was another sign that Ma was disturbed, that the pharaoh had lost the favor of the gods. The psychological weight of this must have been immense. Second, you had to look the part. You had to project an aura of calm, divine power, even in the face of sheer terror. Any sign of fear or weakness would undermine the very foundation of your authority, both with your army and with your people. So the pharaoh was a priest, a warrior, and the nation's connection to the river. But even when they weren't at war or in a temple, the pressure continued inside the palace walls. The court was not a place of relaxation, but a web of intrigue. We imagine the royal family as a united front, but the reality was often one of intense competition. The question of who would be the next pharaoh was the most important issue in the kingdom, and it created dangerous rivalries. A pharaoh had to constantly watch their back. Siblings, cousins, even their own children could be plotting to seize power. The succession was rarely a simple, clear-cut line. It often involved strategic marriages and political maneuvering to secure a chosen heir's position. Marriage itself was a tool of the state. Pharaohs often married their own sisters or half-sisters. This wasn't about romance. It was about consolidating the divine bloodline and keeping power concentrated within a very small, trusted circle. This created a closed, claustrophobic environment where loyalty was always in question. A quiet conversation in a hallway could be a plot. A shared meal could be an opportunity for poison. The pharaoh was powerful, but also deeply isolated and potentially surrounded by enemies. And even with all these pressures in life, perhaps the greatest responsibility of all was planning for death. From the moment a pharaoh took the throne, they began the most important building project of their reign, their own tomb. The pyramids and the tombs in the Valley of the Kings were not monuments to ego. They were complex machines for the afterlife. They were designed to ensure the pharaoh's soul could successfully navigate the underworld and be reborn with the gods. If the pharaoh failed in this journey, it was believed the entire cosmic order could be jeopardized. Their successful rebirth was linked to the continued prosperity of Egypt itself. So building the tomb was a matter of national and cosmic security. This was a massive undertaking, requiring a huge workforce, incredible resources, and decades of planning. The pharaoh had to oversee its construction, ensuring every magical text was carved correctly and every chamber was properly aligned. It was a race against their own mortality. Imagine the constant nagging thought in the back of your mind: will my tomb be ready in time? An early, unexpected death could throw the entire project into chaos, potentially dooming your soul and, with it, the stability of your kingdom. This is why they were filled with so much treasure. It wasn't just wealth. It was all the equipment, the food, the furniture, the spells, the boats, that the pharaoh would need to survive their dangerous journey through the afterlife. This obsession with death wasn't morbid. To the Egyptians, it was a profoundly practical part of the job. A pharaoh's duty didn't end when they stopped breathing. They had one final, terrifying responsibility to fulfill: to successfully become a god. And beneath all of this cosmic and political weight was a simple, fragile human being. Despite their divine status, pharaohs were flesh and blood. They got sick, they felt pain, and they suffered from the same ailments as their subjects. Mummy studies have revealed the physical reality of their lives. Many pharaohs had terrible dental problems, with painful abscesses that would have caused constant agony. They suffered from arthritis, infections from parasites in the Nile, and injuries sustained in battle or from accidents. But there was no relief for this divine suffering, no escape from the frailties of the human body. The pharaoh had access to the best doctors in Egypt, but their medicine was a mixture of practical knowledge and potent magic. A broken bone might be set correctly, but a raging infection or a painful internal illness would be treated with spells, amulets, and potions made from questionable ingredients. Imagine being the most powerful person in the known world, a living god, yet being utterly helpless against a searing toothache. You would endure the same agonizing pain as the poorest farmer, but with the added psychological weight that your suffering could be interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure. The priests would chant, the doctors would apply their poultices, but the pain would remain, a constant, humbling reminder that beneath the golden crown and sacred linen was a body that was just as fragile and prone to decay as any other. This physical weakness was a terrifying political liability. The pharaoh was supposed to be a symbol of divine perfection, the vigorous and eternal protector of Egypt. An image of sickness or frailty could shatter that illusion in an instant, suggesting to the people and to ambitious rivals that the pharaoh's connection to the gods was weakening. This is why official art almost never shows a pharaoh as old, sick, or disabled. They are eternally young, strong, and athletic, frozen in an idealized state of power. In reality, this meant that any illness had to be carefully concealed. The pharaoh likely spent a great deal of time and energy hiding their pain, projecting an image of robust health to the court and the public while privately enduring their ailments. It was another exhausting performance, another mask they had to wear on top of all the others, for fear that a simple cough or a limp could be seen as a crack in the foundation of cosmic order. We can see this hidden reality in the mummified remains of some of Egypt's greatest rulers. Take Amenhotep III, who presided over an era of unprecedented wealth and artistic splendor, a true golden age. He was known as the dazzling sun disk, a title that evokes an image of supreme power and radiance. But his mummy tells a different, much sadder story. In his final years, he was likely in a state of constant, debilitating pain. He suffered from multiple, severe dental abscesses that would have been excruciating, potentially leading to systemic infections that poisoned his entire body. This magnificent king, who built colossal statues of himself and corresponded with other great kings as an equal, likely struggled to eat and speak, his divine authority undermined by the simple, mundane agony of rotting teeth. The image of the dazzling Sun King was a carefully maintained fiction, while the reality was an old man in pain, trapped within his own failing body. This stark contrast between the divine image and the painful human reality is perhaps the most profound truth about being pharaoh. They were expected to be perfect, eternal, and all-powerful, the conduit through which the gods blessed the world. But they were trapped in bodies that got old, got sick, and felt pain. All the gold in the kingdom, all the prayers of the priests, all the armies at their command, could not stop a tooth from decaying or a joint from aching. It serves as the ultimate lesson in the burden of their office. They were worshipped as gods but were forced to suffer like mortals, and the most terrifying part was that they had to pretend the suffering wasn't happening at all. If you thought the cosmic pressures were bad, imagine facing them while nursing a pounding headache you could never admit to having. But not all pressures were cosmic or physical. Some of the most intense struggles were deeply personal and political, born from the rigid traditions that governed the throne itself. Sometimes, the greatest challenge wasn't placating a god or fighting an enemy army, but simply being the wrong person for the job in the eyes of society. The story of one particular pharaoh shows that even when you did everything right, your very existence could be seen as a disruption to the natural order, forcing you into a constant battle for legitimacy. This was the terrifying reality for a woman who dared to rule not as a queen, but as a king, forcing her to make an extraordinary choice to secure her power. Her name was Hatshepsut, and her reign was one of the most successful and strangest in Egyptian history. When we first meet Hatshepsut, she is perfectly positioned within the traditional power structure of the royal court. She was the daughter of one pharaoh, Thutmose I, and the wife of another, her own half-brother Thutmose II. She held the highest religious title a woman could have, God's wife of Amun. On paper, she was the ideal royal woman, a pillar of support for the male lineage that was destined to rule. When her husband died, the throne passed to his young son, Thutmose III, who was still a small child. As the boy's stepmother and the most powerful woman in the kingdom, Hatshepsut was named his regent. Her job was clear and traditional. She was to rule in the boy's name, guiding the country and protecting the throne until he was old enough to take his rightful place as king. This was her expected role, to be a temporary caretaker of power. But Hatshepsut had other plans. Simply being a regent, a temporary placeholder, was not enough for her. Within a few years of taking control, she did something absolutely unprecedented and utterly audacious. She declared herself pharaoh, not a queen ruling for a king, but a full co-ruler, with all the titles, power, and authority that came with the office. She effectively promoted herself, pushing her young stepson into the background. This was a shocking break with centuries of tradition. While Egypt had powerful queens before, the role of pharaoh, the Horus king, the living embodiment of the male sky god, was fundamentally exclusively masculine. By taking this title for herself, Hatshepsut wasn't just making a political move. She was challenging the very cosmic and religious foundations of the kingship. And that was an incredibly dangerous gamble. To justify this radical power grab, Hatshepsut needed a story, a divine explanation that would be so powerful it could override centuries of male-dominated tradition. She couldn't simply say she was more qualified or more ambitious. She had to prove that her rule was the will of the gods themselves. So she commissioned an elaborate series of carvings on the walls of her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri that told a new, revised version of her birth. In this story, the great god Amun-Ra, the king of all gods, desires to create the next ruler of Egypt. He takes the form of her father, the pharaoh Thutmose I, visits her mother in the palace, and conceives a child. That child, she claimed, was her. Her story was that she was not the daughter of a mortal man, but the direct, biological daughter of the most powerful god in the pantheon. This was a stroke of absolute political genius. By claiming direct divine parentage from Amun-Ra, she was leapfrogging the normal line of succession. She was essentially arguing that her right to rule came not from her father or her husband, but from the king of the gods himself, who had personally chosen her for this role before she was even born. She was positioning herself as more divine, more legitimate than her stepson. This narrative was reinforced everywhere. She plastered it on her monuments and temples, making it the official, undeniable truth. It was a brilliant propaganda campaign designed to silence any dissenters. After all, who could argue with a story that said the chief god had personally ordained her to be king? To question her rule was to question the word of Amun-Ra himself. Even with this powerful divine narrative, Hatshepsut still faced the fundamental problem of her gender. The institution of the pharaoh was intrinsically male. All of the titles, all of the rituals, and all of the iconography were designed for a man. The king was the strong bull, the son of Ra, the warrior who protected Egypt from its enemies. How could a woman fit into this rigid masculine mold? Her solution was as pragmatic as it was bizarre to our modern eyes. In order to be a successful pharaoh, she concluded, she needed to look like one. So in most of her official statues and temple reliefs, she had herself depicted not as a woman, but as a man. She was shown wearing the traditional short kilt of the male pharaoh, the iconic striped headdress, and, most famously, the false beard symbolic of kingship. This visual transformation is one of the most fascinating aspects of her reign. It's important to understand this wasn't about her personal identity. It was a calculated political strategy. She wasn't trying to be a man in her daily life. She was using the established visual language of power to make her rule understandable and acceptable to her people. The role of pharaoh had a uniform, and she put it on. In some statues, you can see a fascinating blend where she has the male pharaonic costume but a more slender feminine physique. In others, she is depicted with broad, masculine shoulders and muscular arms, completely indistinguishable from her male predecessors. She was willing to have her own image completely remade, to have her gender erased in her official portraits, all for the sake of maintaining power and upholding the traditions of the office she had claimed. And her strategy worked. Hatshepsut went on to have one of the most peaceful and prosperous reigns in Egyptian history. Instead of focusing on military conquest, she poured the nation's resources into massive building projects, constructing and restoring temples up and down the Nile. Her monuments were more numerous and often grander than those of many male pharaohs who came before her. Her crowning achievement was her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, a stunning, terraced masterpiece that is one of the wonders of ancient architecture. She also re-established trade networks that had been disrupted, most famously sending a massive expedition to the distant land of Punt, which brought back incredible riches like incense, exotic animals, and living trees. She was, by any objective measure, a brilliant and effective ruler. She brought stability and wealth to Egypt, fulfilling the pharaoh's core duty to maintain order and prosperity. Throughout her long reign of over 20 years, her stepson, Thutmose III, was waiting in the wings. He was not imprisoned or exiled. He was made the head of the armies, a powerful and important position. It seems they maintained a functional working relationship, with Hatshepsut as the senior co-ruler and Thutmose as her junior partner. But the underlying tension must have been immense. He was, by all traditional rights, the true king, yet he had to stand by and watch as his stepmother wore the crown, built the grandest monuments, and took all the credit. He was growing into a man, a trained military leader, yet he remained second in command to a woman who had seized his throne. He had to bide his time, knowing that his destiny was being held in check by the sheer force of her will and the brilliance of her political maneuvering. When Hatshepsut finally died of natural causes, likely from cancer, Thutmose III at last became the sole pharaoh of Egypt. He went on to become one of the greatest military leaders in the nation's history, often called the Napoleon of Egypt, expanding the empire to its furthest extent. For the first 20 years of his solo reign, he seemed to respect his stepmother's legacy. Her monuments remained untouched, and her name remained on the official king lists. But then, late in his life, something changed. He ordered a systematic campaign to erase her memory from history. Her name was chiseled off temple walls, her statues were smashed and buried in pits, and her image was removed from reliefs. He attempted to write her out of existence, to pretend that her reign had never happened. The reason for this posthumous attack is still debated by historians. Was it simple revenge, the act of a man who had resented her for decades? Or was it a more calculated political decision? Perhaps he or his advisors feared that her successful reign might inspire other royal women to seize the throne in the future. By erasing her, he may have been trying to restore the traditional, male-only line of succession and ensure that her audacious precedent was never repeated. Whatever the reason, it adds a final, tragic layer to her story. She overcame immense obstacles to become a great pharaoh, only to have her legacy almost completely wiped away. Her story demonstrates that even for the most successful ruler, the responsibility of the office could follow you and try to destroy you even after death. If Hatshepsut's story shows the terrifying pressure to conform to tradition, our next pharaoh's story shows the catastrophic consequences of defying it completely. He didn't just bend the rules. He took the entire rulebook of what it meant to be pharaoh, set it on fire, and threw it into the Nile. This king is perhaps the most controversial and fascinating ruler in all of Egyptian history. He is seen by some as a brilliant visionary, the world's first monotheist. To others, and certainly to most of his own people, he was a dangerous heretic, a madman who abandoned his sacred duties and plunged the entire cosmos into chaos. His name was originally Amenhotep IV, but the world would come to know him by the name he chose for himself, Akhenaten. The core responsibility of the pharaoh, for over 1,000 years, had been to act as the chief priest and intermediary for a vast pantheon of gods. While the specific importance of certain gods could shift over time, the system itself was stable. The king honored all the gods on behalf of the people. At the time Akhenaten took the throne, the most powerful and wealthy cult was that of Amun-Ra, the king of the gods, whose main temple was at Thebes. The priests of Amun-Ra controlled vast estates, enormous wealth, and wielded immense political influence, sometimes even rivaling that of the pharaoh himself. The expectation for any new pharaoh was simple: respect the traditions, honor the gods, and, above all, keep the powerful priesthood of Amun-Ra happy. It was a job of maintenance, not revolution. Akhenaten, however, had a profoundly different religious experience. Early in his reign, he declared that there was only one true god that deserved worship. This was not Amun-Ra, or Osiris, or Isis, but a deity called the Aten, which was represented visually as the physical disk of the sun, whose rays ended in little hands that offered the gift of life. To Akhenaten, all the other gods were false idols. This wasn't just a preference, it was a total theological revolution. He began by closing the temples dedicated to Amun-Ra and diverting their immense revenues to the cult of the Aten. This was a direct assault on the most powerful religious and economic institution in the country. He was, in effect, staging a divine coup, firing the old gods and their thousands of priests and replacing them with his own single deity. This religious revolution was only the beginning of his radical transformation of Egypt. He changed his own name from Amenhotep, which meant Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. Then, in a move that must have stunned the entire kingdom, he abandoned the ancient capital city of Thebes, the sacred center of Amun-Ra's cult. He moved his entire court and administration to a brand new, purpose-built capital city in the middle of the desert, a place we now call Amarna. He called it Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. This was an incredible undertaking. He was not just changing the religion, he was physically uprooting the entire political and religious center of the kingdom, moving it to a virgin site dedicated solely to his new god. He was attempting to create a new world, a clean slate, free from the traditions of the past. For the average Egyptian, this would have been terrifying. Their entire worldview was built on a reciprocal relationship with hundreds of gods who governed every aspect of life, from the flooding of the Nile to the safety of childbirth. Suddenly, their king, the one man whose job was to maintain that relationship, told them those gods were irrelevant. The temples where they had worshipped for generations were shut down. The familiar rituals and festivals that marked the passage of time were canceled. Akhenaten wasn't just introducing a new god, he was severing the people's connection to the divine forces they believed kept their world running. It would have felt like the cosmic order, the very fabric of Ma'at, was being deliberately torn apart by the one person who was supposed to protect it. It was a forced spiritual crisis on a national scale. The new religion that Akhenaten created was also profoundly exclusive. In the old system, anyone could, in theory, appeal to the gods through prayers and offerings at the temples. But in Akhenaten's system, the Aten was a universal, remote creator god who could not be worshipped directly by the common people. The only way to access the Aten was through an intermediary, and there was only one intermediary for all of humanity, Akhenaten himself. He and his wife, Nefertiti, became the sole priests of the new religion. For anyone else to worship the Aten, they first had to worship the pharaoh and his family. He didn't just make himself the chief priest, he made himself and his family the new gods on earth, the only bridge between humanity and the divine. This made him more powerful, in theory, but also more isolated than any pharaoh before him. This intense focus on his new religion and his new city seems to have come at a great cost to the rest of his kingdom. Historical records from the period, known as the Amarna letters, show that while Akhenaten was composing beautiful hymns to the sun disk, the Egyptian empire abroad was crumbling. Vassal kings in Syria and Palestine wrote desperate letters to the pharaoh, begging for troops and support as rival powers invaded their lands. The letters show a pattern of neglect, with pleas going unanswered as Egyptian territories were lost. Akhenaten, so consumed with his internal spiritual revolution, seemed to have lost interest in his traditional role as a warrior king and protector of the empire. He was failing at one of the most basic responsibilities of his office, allowing chaos to grow at the borders while he pursued his divine vision. The art from the Amarna period is as revolutionary and unsettling as the religion. Gone are the idealized muscular images of the eternally youthful pharaoh. Akhenaten had himself and his family depicted with startlingly strange features: an elongated skull, a long, thin neck, a sagging belly, wide hips, and skinny limbs. Art historians still debate why he chose to be portrayed this way. Was it a realistic depiction of a genetic condition, or was it a symbolic choice, an attempt to create a new visual style that was as different from the past as his religion was? Perhaps he wanted to appear as an otherworldly being, neither male nor female, a unique physical vessel for his unique God. Whatever the reason, these images would have been deeply strange and possibly disturbing to Egyptians accustomed to the traditional, heroic depictions of their kings. Ultimately, Akhenaten's grand experiment was a catastrophic failure. His religion never truly took hold beyond the confines of his new city and the royal court. The common people likely continued to worship their old gods in secret, waiting for the madness to pass. When Akhenaten died after 17 years on the throne, his revolution died with him. His new city of Amarna was quickly abandoned, left to be swallowed by the desert sands. The old religion came roaring back with a vengeance, led by the very priests of Amun-Ra that he had tried to destroy. His name was vilified, his monuments were torn down, and official records attempted to erase him from history entirely. For later generations of Egyptians, he was not remembered as a visionary, but as the criminal of Akhetaten, the heretic king who had angered the gods and endangered the entire nation. Akhenaten's story is the ultimate cautionary tale of pharaonic responsibility. His reign demonstrates what happened when a pharaoh put their own personal vision above their sacred duty to maintain Ma'at. He saw himself as a reformer, but his people saw him as a destroyer. He believed he was bringing them a universal truth, but in their eyes, he was leading them into a cosmic darkness by abandoning the divine pact that had kept Egypt safe for millennia. He is proof that the pharaoh's power was not absolute. It was conditional, based on upholding the traditions that gave the world structure and meaning. By shattering those traditions, he didn't free his people, he terrified them. And in doing so, he failed in the most fundamental way a pharaoh possibly could. And the person who had to clean up this colossal cosmic mess was just a child, a boy whose name is now the most famous in all of Egyptian history, not because of what he did in life, but because of what was found in his tomb after death. His story is not one of great personal achievement, but of an immense burden passed down to a child who was physically and politically unprepared to carry it. We know him today as Tutankhamun, the boy king, but the weight on his small shoulders was as heavy as any of the great pharaohs who came before him. His entire reign was a carefully orchestrated act of damage control, an attempt to heal a nation that had been spiritually broken by his father. The myth of Tutankhamun is one of glamour and mystery, defined by the breathtaking solid gold mask and the thousands of glittering artifacts that filled his tomb. When Howard Carter opened that tomb in 1922, the world saw an image of unimaginable wealth and power. This discovery created a romanticized vision of a boy king living a life of supreme luxury, a golden pharaoh from a fairy tale. We imagine him as a strong, vital ruler, perhaps a bit of a mystery, but ultimately the embodiment of pharaonic splendor. His name became synonymous with the treasures of ancient Egypt, a symbol of a lost golden age. But the reality of his life was far from glamorous. It was a life of physical pain, political manipulation, and crushing religious responsibility. The first brutal reality of Tutankhamun's life was his health. He was the product of generations of royal inbreeding, Genetic analysis of his mummy has confirmed that his parents were brother and sister. This left him with a host of severe congenital conditions. He had a cleft palate, a deformed club-like foot that would have required him to walk with a cane, and a degenerative bone disease in his other foot that would have caused him chronic pain. Over 100 walking sticks and canes were found in his tomb, not as symbols of authority, but as genuine mobility aids that he needed to get around. This was the boy tasked with restoring the might of Egypt, a frail, disabled teenager who likely lived in constant physical discomfort. The powerful image of the Golden King was a fiction. The reality was a struggling youth with significant health challenges. He took the throne when he was only around 9 years old. A child of that age, especially one with his physical ailments, could not possibly have ruled on his own. He was a king in name only, a pawn in a game played by the powerful adults who surrounded him. The real power behind the throne was held by figures like I, a high-ranking courtier and advisor, and Horemheb, the commander-in-chief of the army. These were the men who had likely survived Akhenaten's reign by keeping their heads down, and they now saw an opportunity to restore the old ways, using this boy king as their public face. Tutankhamun's reign was not his own. It was a carefully managed political project orchestrated by the old guard to undo the damage of his father's revolution. The most important act of his reign, and one that was almost certainly decided for him, was the complete rejection of his father's religion. His birth name was Tutankhaten, meaning living image of the Aten, a name that tied him directly to the heretical god. Early in his rule, his name was officially changed to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun. This was a monumental public statement. It signaled to everyone in Egypt, and to the gods themselves, that the Aten was out, and the old pantheon, led by Amun-Ra, was back in charge. This was the first step in a nationwide campaign to restore Ma'at. The court was moved back to the traditional capital of Thebes, and a massive program was launched to reopen and repair the temples that Akhenaten had closed. It was a national apology tour, with a child king as its symbol. One of the most important documents from his reign is a stone slab known as the Restoration Stela. On it, Tutankhamun, or rather the men ruling through him, describes the state of Egypt as they found it. The text paints a grim picture, declaring that the temples of the gods and goddesses had fallen into ruin. Their shrines were deserted. The land was in distress. The gods had turned their backs on this land. It goes on to describe how Tutankhamun, as the new king, dedicated himself to fixing this mess, spending a fortune on new statues for the gods, rebuilding the temples, and restoring the privileges of the priests. The entire text is a piece of propaganda designed to show that the king was actively healing the cosmic rift created by his father and putting the world back in order. Imagine the pressure on this young boy. He was not just a king, he was the living symbol of this restoration. He would have been led through endless, complex religious ceremonies that he may have barely understood, reciting ancient words and performing sacred actions, all designed to placate the gods that his own father had declared to be fake. He was forced to publicly and systematically denounce his father's entire legacy, a heavy psychological burden for any child. His life was not one of youthful freedom, but of rigid ritual and political performance. Every public appearance was a carefully staged event to reassure the people that the proper order of the universe was being reestablished, and that he was the pious, traditional king they had been desperately waiting for. His death at the young age of around 19 is still a subject of debate. For a long time, it was believed he was murdered, but modern analysis of his mummy suggests a more mundane and perhaps sadder cause of death. He likely suffered a severe leg fracture, which, combined with his already poor health and a possible case of malaria, led to a fatal infection. His sudden death threw the court into a minor crisis, as he had no surviving children to inherit the throne. The hasty nature of his burial is evident in his tomb. It is much smaller than that of other pharaohs, suggesting it was a non-royal tomb that was quickly repurposed for him. The famous treasures, while magnificent, show signs of being hastily assembled, some items perhaps even being borrowed from the funerary equipment of other royals. The sheer quantity of treasure packed into his small tomb was not just a display of wealth, it was likely a desperate attempt to ensure his success in the afterlife. Given the heresy of his father and his own physically weak state, his advisors may have felt he needed all the magical and material help he could get to successfully navigate the dangerous journey through the underworld and be accepted by the gods. They packed his tomb with over 5,000 objects, from golden chariots to food to board games, everything a king could possibly need to survive and thrive in the next world. It was a way of compensating for his short, difficult life and giving him the best possible chance at a successful eternity, which was seen as crucial for the continued stability of Egypt. So the golden mask that stares out at us with such calm and eternal serenity is profoundly deceptive. It hides the story of a disabled boy, born from incest, who was handed a broken kingdom at the age of 9. He was a puppet king whose entire life was dedicated to being the public face of a religious counter-reformation. He lived in constant pain, bore the heavy burden of his father's sins, and died before he ever had a chance to truly rule on his own. His treasures are not a testament to a glorious life, but rather the remnants of a desperate attempt to secure a glorious afterlife for a boy who had very little power or happiness while he was alive. His story is not one of glamour. It's one of the heaviest responsibilities imaginable placed upon the weakest of shoulders. This constant dance with death, this overwhelming need to prepare for the afterlife, shaped every aspect of a pharaoh's reign. It wasn't a side project, it was the main event. But what happened when things went wrong? When the carefully laid plans for eternity were disrupted? The story of the royal tombs reveals another layer of terrifying responsibility, not just preparing for your own death, but protecting the tombs of your ancestors. The Valley of the Kings, that famous royal cemetery carved into the desert cliffs, was supposed to be a secret, sacred place. But over the centuries, it became a target, not just for common thieves, but for organized criminals, leading to a desperate, centuries-long battle to protect the bodies of the divine kings. The myth of the pharaoh's tomb is one of impregnable fortresses, protected by ingenious traps and deadly curses, all designed to keep intruders out forever. We have this image from movies of giant rolling boulders, poisoned darts shooting from walls, and vengeful spirits guarding the treasure. This is a wonderfully romantic idea, suggesting that the Egyptians had a magical and technological ability to secure their tombs that we can barely comprehend. The popular belief is that these protections were highly effective and that only a few unlucky tombs were ever disturbed. The reality, however, was that almost every single tomb in the Valley of the Kings was robbed in antiquity, many of them within just a few generations of the pharaoh's burial. The traps and curses were a complete failure. The real security for the tombs was secrecy and a dedicated police force, the Medjay, who patrolled the valley. But these measures were no match for the immense temptation of the treasures buried within. The tomb robbers were not simple opportunists. They were often highly organized gangs, sometimes even including the very stonecutters who had built the tombs and the priests who were supposed to be guarding them. These were people who knew the layouts, the locations of the secret doors, and the schedule of the patrols. They worked in teams, tunneling through solid rock for days or weeks to bypass the sealed entrances and reach the burial chambers. Once inside, they worked quickly, grabbing the most valuable items, gold, silver, precious stones, and fine linens, before melting back into the night. It was a constant, ongoing problem. For the pharaohs of the later New Kingdom, such as Ramesses IX and Ramesses XI, this became a full-blown national crisis. Official court documents from this period, known as the tomb robbery papyri, record the trials of captured thieves. These documents give us a shocking insight into the scale of the problem. They reveal widespread corruption that went all the way to the top of the local government at Thebes. One famous trial involved the mayor of Thebes being accused of being complicit in the robberies, or at the very least, turning a blind eye in exchange for a cut of the profits. The pharaoh, ruling from his capital far to the north, was faced with the terrifying reality that the very officials he entrusted to protect his ancestors were helping to desecrate them. This wasn't just a matter of stolen property. To the Egyptians, the desecration of a tomb was a horrifying cosmic crime. A pharaoh's body needed to remain intact for their spirit to survive and be reborn in the afterlife. The magical spells and items buried with them were essential equipment for this journey. When robbers broke in, they didn't just steal the gold. They often ripped the mummy apart to get at the valuable amulets wrapped within the bandages. They broke open the coffins and smashed the funerary equipment. In doing so, they were effectively murdering the pharaoh for a second time, potentially destroying their chance at eternal life. For the living pharaoh, this was an unthinkable failure of their duty to protect their divine lineage and maintain Ma'at. It was a sign that chaos was overwhelming order. The situation eventually became so desperate that the priests of Amun in Thebes took a radical and drastic step. Under the cover of darkness, they began a secret operation to save the bodies of the great kings of the past. They went from tomb to tomb in the Valley of the Kings, opening the plundered chambers of legendary pharaohs like Seti I, Ramesses the Great, and Thutmose III. They gathered up what was left of their desecrated burials, the violated royal mummies, often stripped of their treasures, and sometimes even their coffins. They repaired the bodies as best they could, rewrapped them in new linen, and added small dockets identifying who they were. It was a desperate act of spiritual conservation, an attempt to save the souls of their ancestors. These priests then moved the royal mummies from one hiding place to another, trying to stay one step ahead of the tomb robbers. Finally, they gathered dozens of these legendary rulers together and reburied them in two secret, unmarked caches. One cache, hidden in a cleft in the cliffs at Deir el-Bahri, contained over 40 royal mummies. Another, inside the tomb of Amenhotep II, held more than a dozen others. There, kings who had once lain in magnificent treasure-filled tombs were stacked together in plain wooden coffins, sometimes several to a room, hidden away like refugees. The great Ramesses himself was found in a simple, undecorated coffin, a far cry from the splendor he had planned for his eternity. This was the final, sad result of the failure to protect the royal burials. This story of the royal mummy caches is a poignant illustration of the immense gap between the pharaonic ideal and the harsh reality. The ideal was a perfect, eternal rest in a secure, treasure-filled tomb, leading to a glorious rebirth as a god. The reality was a desperate scramble by a few loyal priests to save the battered bodies of their kings from grave robbers, ending with them being hidden away in a secret pit. The living pharaoh during this period must have felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Their responsibility was to protect their ancestors, but the forces of corruption and greed were so powerful that the only solution was to abandon the magnificent tombs entirely and hide the kings away, hoping they would finally be left in peace. This brings us to the final and perhaps most human of the pharaoh's terrifying responsibilities, the simple, profound pressure of legacy. Every pharaoh was acutely aware that they were just one link in a very long chain stretching back to the dawn of time. Their duty was not just to rule well in the present, but to live up to the legendary achievements of their ancestors and to secure their own place in that immortal timeline. They were in a constant competition with the past. When a pharaoh like Ramesses the Great built his colossal temples, he wasn't just honoring the gods, he was also ensuring that his name and his image would be bigger and more impressive than those of the pharaohs who came before him. This obsession with legacy is why pharaohs were so keen on building. Monuments were a way to achieve a kind of earthly immortality. A temple or a giant statue was a permanent statement, a way of carving your name into the landscape of Egypt forever. But this also led to a strange and competitive practice. Pharaohs would often usurp the monuments of their predecessors. A later king might erase the name of the original builder from a statue or a temple wall and carve his own name in its place, effectively stealing the monument for his own legacy. It was a ruthless way of editing history, ensuring that your own memory would shine brighter by literally plastering it over someone else's. This shows the intense anxiety they felt about being remembered. The ultimate fear for a pharaoh was not just being killed, but being forgotten. To be forgotten was to cease to exist, to lose your place in the eternal cycle. This is why the attempt to erase the names of Hatshepsut and Akhenaten was considered such a terrible punishment. It was an attack on their very soul, an attempt to deny them their afterlife by removing them from the memory of the living. This pressure to be remembered, to have your name spoken by future generations and your offerings maintained in the temples, was a driving force behind so much of what they did. Their entire reign was, in a sense, a massive campaign to ensure they would not be dismissed by history or erased by a future, rival king. And so we see the full picture. The pharaoh was not a carefree deity enjoying a life of luxury. They were the focal point of immense, crushing pressures from every direction. They were held personally responsible for the flooding of the Nile and the rising of the sun. They had to maintain the delicate cosmic balance of Ma'at through endless, repetitive rituals. They were expected to be fearless warrior kings on the battlefield. They had to navigate the treacherous politics of their own court and family. They suffered from the same painful diseases and frailties as any mortal, but had to hide their weakness behind a mask of divine perfection. And they did all of this under the constant, nagging anxiety of their own death, their afterlife, and their ultimate legacy. It was a job that required the perfect performance of multiple, often contradictory roles. You had to be a devout priest and a brutal warrior. You had to be a living god, yet you were trapped in a failing human body. You had to project absolute authority, yet you were often a pawn in the hands of powerful advisors or a prisoner of rigid tradition. The golden image of the pharaoh that we see in our museums is the most successful propaganda campaign in human history. It was an illusion of calm, eternal power, deliberately created to hide the terrifying reality that the person behind the mask was carrying the weight of the entire universe on their shoulders, every single day, with absolutely no room for failure. Thinking about this burden changes how we see everything they left behind. The Great Pyramids are not just monuments to ego. They are expressions of a desperate need to fulfill a final, cosmic duty. The intricate spells on the walls of their tombs are not just decoration. They are a user's manual for a terrifying journey they believed they had to take to keep the world from falling apart. The colossal statues are not just about arrogance. They are a desperate attempt to anchor a legacy in stone, to fight against the terror of being forgotten. Every piece of art, every temple, every inscription is a testament not to their power, but to the immense pressures that defined their existence. So when you next see the serene, golden face of Tutankhamun, try to look past the wealth. See the frail boy who was forced to carry the sins of his father. When you see a statue of Ramesses the Great as a mighty conqueror, remember the man who likely had terrible dental pain and who knew his ancestors. Bodies were being pulled from their graves by thieves. The story of the pharaohs is not a story of absolute power. It's a story of an impossible job with terrifying responsibilities, where the fate of the world, both seen and unseen, rested squarely on the shoulders of one very isolated, very burdened, and very human individual. If the great cosmic and spiritual burdens weren't enough, there was another, more mundane layer of responsibility that was just as crushing. The pharaoh was the chief executive officer of a vast and complex nation. We tend to focus on the golden masks and the divine rituals, but a huge portion of the pharaoh's time, and certainly their mental energy, would have been consumed by the relentless, grinding machinery of the state. They were the head of a massive bureaucracy that managed everything from tax collection to irrigation projects to to the national food supply. Every decision, no matter how small it seemed, ultimately flowed upwards to the throne. The pharaoh was the final authority on everything, and the sheer volume of information and the number of decisions they had to process would have been utterly overwhelming. They were not just a god, they were the ultimate administrator, the final signature on every piece of paperwork in the kingdom. The central pillar of this entire administrative system was grain. Egypt's wealth wasn't measured in gold, but in the amount of wheat and barley stored in the state granaries. This grain was the national currency. It was collected as taxes from farmers, and it was paid out as wages to everyone who worked for the state, from the soldiers in the army to the artisans decorating the royal tombs. The pharaoh was therefore not just a king, but the nation's chief quartermaster. They were personally responsible for ensuring that the granaries were full, that taxes were collected fairly, and that the vast state workforce was paid and fed on time. A failure in this system didn't just mean a budget shortfall. It meant hungry soldiers, striking workers, and the potential for widespread civil unrest. The stability of the entire kingdom rested on the pharaoh's ability to manage the grain supply effectively. Imagine the logistical nightmare this presented. The pharaoh, through their network of scribes and officials, had to keep track of harvests in every province of the kingdom. They had to organize the transportation of millions of bushels of grain by boat up and down the Nile. They had to manage a massive network of storage facilities, protecting them from pests, mold, and thieves. And they had to oversee a complex system of redistribution. We have records from Deir el-Medina, the village where the tomb builders lived, that detail their monthly wages in grain, fish, and beer. When these payments were late, which sometimes happened, the workers would go on strike, the first recorded labor strikes in history. And who was ultimately blamed for this failure? The pharaoh. It was their responsibility to keep the system running smoothly. This economic responsibility extended to every major project in the kingdom. When a pharaoh decided to build a new temple or a pyramid, it wasn't a simple act of divine will. It was a colossal project management challenge. They had to commission the architects, organize the conscription of tens of thousands of laborers, and establish a supply chain that could move millions of tons of stone, sometimes from quarries hundreds of miles away. And, most importantly, they had to figure out how to feed and house this entire workforce for years, or even decades. The construction of a single great monument was one of the most complex logistical operations in the ancient world, and the pharaoh was the project manager-in-chief, the one person who would be held accountable for its success or failure. So while the pharaoh was busy performing rituals to ensure the cosmic order, they were also being handed reports from their vizier about grain yields in a distant province, or a shortfall in copper production at the mines in Sinai, or a delay in the shipment of cedar wood from Lebanon. It was a relentless barrage of practical problems that required practical solutions. This aspect of the job had none of the glamour of being a living god, but it was just as critical to the survival of Egypt. A pharaoh who was a brilliant priest but a poor administrator would quickly find their kingdom falling into chaos and famine. They had to be both a divine being and a ruthlessly efficient bureaucrat, a dual role that must have been incredibly taxing. Alongside this administrative burden was another, equally heavy responsibility. The pharaoh was the supreme judge of all Egypt. They were the living embodiment of the law, the final court of appeal, and the ultimate source of justice in the land. This role was a direct extension of their duty to uphold Ma'at. Justice was not just a legal concept, it was a fundamental component of cosmic harmony. An unjust verdict was not merely a mistake, it was an act that weakened the fabric of the universe. The pharaoh, therefore, carried the weight of ensuring that every legal dispute in the kingdom was settled correctly and fairly. While most day-to-day cases were handled by lower courts and officials, the most difficult cases, and any appeals, could theoretically make their way all the way to the throne. In the official instructions given to a newly appointed vizier, the pharaoh would explicitly remind them to be impartial. Regard one you know like one you don't know, one near you like one far from you. The text commands, This shows how seriously they took the ideal of justice. But this ideal was always filtered through the pharaoh, who was its ultimate guardian. Imagine the pressure of being the final arbiter of life and death. A case of murder, a dispute over land inheritance that could ruin a family, or an accusation of treason against a high official. These were the kinds of decisions that would land on the pharaoh's desk. They would have to listen to the arguments, weigh the evidence, and deliver a verdict that was not only legally sound but also divinely correct. A single wrong decision could have devastating consequences for the people involved and for the spiritual health of the nation. This role as supreme judge also made the pharaoh the target of every petition and complaint in the kingdom. In theory, any Egyptian, no matter how humble, had the right to appeal directly to the pharaoh for justice. While in practice this was probably very difficult to do, the principle remained. The pharaoh was seen as the protector of the weak and the champion of the common person. We have texts, like the Tale of the Eloquent Peasant, which tell the story of a farmer who is robbed by a corrupt official and then makes a series of brilliant, poetic appeals for justice that eventually reach the ears of the king. While this is a fictional story, it reflects the deep-seated cultural belief that the pharaoh's most sacred duty was to ensure that no one was denied justice. This created an enormous expectation that they had to live up to. This constant pressure to be the perfect, infallible judge was another aspect of the relentless performance of being pharaoh. They couldn't show indecision. They couldn't be seen to favor the rich and powerful over the poor and humble. They had to project an aura of serene, divine wisdom at all times. Even when dealing with complex, messy human problems, they had to appear to be channeling the perfect clarity of Ma'at. It was a role that required incredible emotional and intellectual discipline. One can only imagine the sleepless nights spent wrestling with a difficult case, knowing that the lives of your subjects and the balance of the cosmos depended on you making the right choice. It was a burden that would crush most modern leaders, let alone one who also had to worry about the mood of the hippo goddess. And even if a pharaoh managed to master the cosmic rituals, the state bureaucracy, and the legal system, they were never truly safe. The one place that should have been a sanctuary, a refuge from the pressures of the outside world, was often the most dangerous place of all, the royal palace itself. The gilded halls and luxurious private quarters were not a home, but a political arena, a hotbed of ambition, jealousy, and conspiracy. The greatest threat to a pharaoh's life often came not from a foreign army but from their own family. The very people who were supposed to be their closest allies, their wives, their siblings, and their children, were frequently their most dangerous rivals. A reality made terrifyingly clear in the story of the end of one great pharaoh's life. Our subject is Ramesses III. He was one of the last truly great warrior pharaohs of the New Kingdom. He had a long and successful reign, famously defeating a massive invasion by a mysterious group known as the Sea Peoples, saving Egypt from the same fate of collapse that had befallen other great Bronze Age civilizations. He built magnificent temples and monuments, and for decades, he presided over a stable and prosperous kingdom. As he entered old age, he had every reason to believe that he had fulfilled his duties, that he had earned a peaceful end to his life and a glorious journey into the afterlife. He was a respected and powerful king, but his greatest enemy was not on the battlefield. It was living down the hall, within the supposedly secure walls of the royal harem. The popular image of the pharaoh's harem is one of decadent pleasure, a place filled with beautiful women dedicated solely to the king's enjoyment. While it was certainly a place of luxury, its primary function was political, not personal. It was where the royal wives and their many children lived. A pharaoh would have one principal wife, the great royal wife, whose son was usually the designated heir. But they would also have numerous secondary wives, some of them foreign princesses, sent to seal diplomatic alliances. Each of these secondary wives also had children, and each of them knew that their own status and the future of their sons depended entirely on who would sit on the throne next. This created an environment of intense competition and simmering resentment, a perfect breeding ground for a conspiracy. As Ramesses III grew old, one of his secondary wives, a woman named Taye, saw her opportunity slipping away. The designated heir was the son of the great royal wife, which meant that her own son, a prince named Pentower, was destined for a life of relative obscurity. But Ta was ambitious. She decided she would not accept this fate. She hatched a plot to assassinate the aging king and place her own son on the throne in a palace coup. This was not just a desperate mother's plan. It was a high-level conspiracy that drew in dozens of people from every level of the palace administration. She recruited other women of the harem, the chief of the chamber, butlers, scribes, and even high-ranking military commanders who were in charge of the troops stationed in the capital. The plotters used every tool at their disposal. According to the court documents that record their trial, they even employed black magic. A palace magician was brought in to create wax figures and magical spells designed to weaken the king and disable his bodyguards. The plan was to strike during a major festival, when the palace would be busy and security might be more relaxed. And it seems they succeeded. For a long time, the mummy of Ramesses III showed no obvious signs of trauma, leading historians to believe the plot had failed. But a recent CT scan revealed the horrifying truth. Hidden beneath the bandages around his neck was a deep, wide gash that severed his windpipe and major arteries. The conspirators had managed to get to the king and cut his throat. The great warrior pharaoh had been murdered in his own home by his own family. The plot was ultimately discovered, likely by the legitimate heir, who quickly rounded up the conspirators and put them on trial. The surviving legal documents detail the charges and the sentences. Many of the key plotters were found guilty and sentenced to death. The Prince Pentower, for whom the entire plot was conceived, was also found guilty and was forced to take his own life. The story is a chilling reminder of the pharaoh's ultimate vulnerability. Ramesses III had successfully defended Egypt from foreign invasion, managed the economy, and honored the gods for decades. Yet, all his power and divine status could not protect him from the simple, human emotions of greed and ambition festering within his own family. It proves that being pharaoh meant you could never relax, never trust anyone completely, and never, ever turn your back. This constant internal pressure was matched by an equally demanding set of pressures from the outside world. The pharaoh was not ruling in a vacuum. Egypt was a superpower in a complex and often hostile international neighborhood. The king was therefore not just a domestic leader, but also the nation's chief diplomat, personally responsible for navigating the treacherous waters of foreign policy. This involved a constant, delicate balancing act of projecting strength, negotiating treaties, and managing alliances with other powerful kingdoms like the Hittites in Anatolia, the Mitanni in Syria, and the Babylonians in Mesopotamia. A single diplomatic blunder could undo years of stability and potentially lead to a devastating war, a war that the pharaoh would be expected to lead and win. Our best insight into this world of ancient diplomacy comes from a remarkable collection of clay tablets discovered in the ruins of Akhenaten's capital city, Amarna. These are the actual diplomatic correspondences sent to the Egyptian pharaoh from other kings and vassal rulers across the Near East. Reading these letters, you get a palpable sense of the demands and complaints that flooded the pharaoh's court on a daily basis. The letters are written in a formal, polite, and often flattering tone, addressing the pharaoh as "my brother" or "my son." But beneath the pleasantries, there is a constant stream of requests, demands, and thinly veiled threats. The pharaoh was expected to be the wealthy and generous leader of the international community, and his fellow kings were not shy about reminding him of this. One of the most common requests in the Amarna letters is for gold. The king of Babylon wrote to the pharaoh, "In your country, gold is as plentiful as dust." This became a common refrain. Foreign rulers constantly pestered the pharaoh for shipments of gold to decorate their palaces or to fund their armies. They would send gifts to the pharaoh, chariots, horses, precious stones, but always with the clear expectation of receiving a much larger and more valuable shipment of gold in return. They would complain if the shipment was late, or if they felt the quality wasn't pure enough. The pharaoh was essentially acting as the central banker for the entire region, and his international reputation depended on his ability and willingness to keep the gold flowing to his allies. It was a constant drain on the treasury and a source of diplomatic friction. Another crucial element of this diplomatic game was royal marriage. To seal a major alliance, a pharaoh would often demand that a foreign king send his daughter to Egypt to become one of the pharaoh's secondary wives. For the foreign king, this was a great honor, a way to tie his own dynasty to the magnificent power of Egypt. For the princess, it was often a tragic fate. These young women were sent hundreds of miles from home to a foreign land where they did not speak the language or know the customs. They would enter the sprawling, competitive world of the Egyptian harem and would likely never see their families again. They were political pawns, their personal happiness sacrificed for the sake of international stability. The pharaoh had to manage these women and the delicate relationships with their powerful fathers and brothers back home. The letters show that these arrangements were not always smooth. The king of Babylon once complained bitterly to the pharaoh that his sister, who had been married to the previous pharaoh, had now seemingly disappeared within the Egyptian court, and that no one would let his messengers see her. He was deeply concerned for her welfare and insulted by the lack of respect. This kind of incident could cause a major diplomatic crisis. The pharaoh was not just managing treaties. He was managing deeply personal family relationships on an international scale. He had to keep his dozens of foreign wives and their powerful families happy, a task that would have required incredible tact and patience. One slight, real or perceived, could unravel an alliance that had taken years to build. Interestingly, while the pharaoh eagerly accepted foreign princesses into his harem, he almost never sent Egyptian princesses abroad to marry foreign kings. When the king of Babylon requested an Egyptian princess for his own wife, the pharaoh Amenhotep III bluntly replied, "From time immemorial, no daughter of the king of Egypt is given to anyone." The reason for this was rooted in their concept of divinity. The royal women of Egypt were seen as carriers of the sacred solar bloodline. To send one of them to a foreign land to marry a lesser, mortal king was unthinkable. It would have been seen as a dilution of their divinity and a diminishment of Egypt's superior status. This arrogance, while reinforcing their divine self-image, also created a constant source of diplomatic tension with their supposed brothers on other thrones. So the pharaoh was constantly juggling these complex international relationships. They were being bombarded with letters from allies demanding gold, complaining about gifts, and worrying about their daughters. At the same time, they were receiving desperate pleas for military aid from vassal states on the frontiers of the empire, who were being attacked by hostile neighbors. They had to decide which allies to support, which threats to take seriously, and how to project an image of unshakable power and infinite wealth, even when the treasury might be running low or the army was stretched thin. It was a high-stakes game of chess played across thousands of miles, where the price of failure was the loss of empire and the humiliation of the living God. This constant need to perform, both for an internal audience and an international one, meant that the pharaoh's life had absolutely no privacy. From the moment they woke to the moment they slept, they were surrounded by people. Servants, priests, scribes, bodyguards, courtiers, and family members were a constant presence. Every action, from getting dressed to eating a meal, was a public ceremony, a ritualized performance freighted with meaning. We have texts that describe the daily ritual of the king, which outlines the elaborate purification and dressing ceremonies that began the pharaoh's day. This wasn't a relaxing morning routine. It was a sacred duty, performed with an audience, designed to transform the mortal man into the divine vessel for that day. There was no off switch. They were the pharaoh 24 hours a day. Even the most personal aspects of life were matters of state. The pharaoh's health, as we've seen, was a subject of national and cosmic importance. Their marriage was a political and religious necessity. And, most critically, Their ability to produce an heir was a fundamental measure of their success. The primary duty of the great royal wife was to give the pharaoh a son who could continue the divine lineage. If she failed to do so, it could be seen as a sign of divine disapproval and could create a succession crisis that would destabilize the entire kingdom. The pressure on the royal couple to produce a male heir must have been immense, turning the most private moments into a performance of dynastic duty. Every aspect of their life was subordinate to the needs of the state and the crown. This complete lack of a private life is one of the most alien and perhaps most terrifying aspects of being pharaoh. They were never just a person. They were always a symbol, an institution, an object of worship. They had no one they could truly confide in without fearing that their words would be used against them. They had no space where they could simply be themselves, away from the watchful eyes of the court. This profound and inescapable loneliness, this existence as a public icon rather than a private individual, might have been the heaviest burden of all. They were surrounded by thousands of people, yet they were likely the most isolated person in the entire kingdom, trapped on a gilded pedestal of their own divinity. All of these responsibilities, cosmic, administrative, judicial, and personal, were compounded by the simple fact that the pharaoh was expected to be a perfect being from the moment they took the throne. There was no room for on-the-job training. They were a god from day one, and they were expected to act like it. For a mature and experienced leader, this was a daunting enough challenge. But often, the crown fell upon the head of someone completely unprepared for it, either a young child or someone who was never meant to be king in the first place. The system demanded a flawless divine ruler, but the realities of human life and succession often provided something very different, creating situations of incredible stress and instability for the person who was suddenly thrust into this impossible role. Consider the situation of a child pharaoh like Tutankhamun, or his later successor Amenemhat III, who likely took the throne as a boy. They were instantly endowed with all the titles and theoretical power of a living god. They were the object of worship in the temples and the ultimate authority in the land. But in reality, they were children. They would have been surrounded by ambitious and powerful adults, viziers, generals, priests, all vying for influence and control over the young king. The child pharaoh would have been a puppet, their days filled with lessons and complex rituals they barely understood, their signature used on decrees they had not written. They had all of the responsibility, but none of the actual power, a terrifyingly vulnerable position to be in. These regencies, when an older official or a royal mother ruled in the name of a young king, were periods of great risk. The regent held immense power, and the temptation to usurp the throne for themselves must have been strong. The young pharaoh had to learn quickly who to trust, navigating a world of whispers and shifting alliances where a seemingly loyal advisor could be their greatest enemy. They had to grow up with the knowledge that their own life was in constant danger, that their claim to the throne was only as strong as the powerful people who chose to support them. It was a childhood defined not by play and freedom, but by political paranoia and the crushing weight of a crown that was far too big for their head. Even for an adult who inherited the throne, the transition could be fraught with peril, especially if their claim was not straightforward. The period immediately following a pharaoh's death was one of cosmic and political instability. The link between the divine and human worlds was temporarily broken. This was the most dangerous time, the moment when a rival claimant or an ambitious courtier might try to seize power. The new pharaoh had to move quickly and decisively to assert their authority. Their first and most important duty was to oversee the burial of their predecessor. By correctly performing the funeral rites, they were not only ensuring the dead king's safe passage to the afterlife, but also demonstrating their own legitimacy as the rightful heir, the new Horus who had taken the place of the dead Osiris. This is why the discovery of a pharaoh's tomb was such a critical part of establishing a new reign. It signaled the final step in the transition of power. But sometimes, things did not go smoothly. The pharaoh I, who succeeded Tutankhamun, was an old courtier with no direct royal blood. He seems to have secured his claim by marrying Tutankhamun's young widow, a move that gave him a tenuous link to the royal family. But his legitimacy was always in question. He was succeeded by the general Horemheb, another man with no royal lineage, who took the throne through pure military power. Horemheb then went to great lengths to erase the memory of his immediate predecessors, Tutankhamun and I, presenting himself as the direct successor of the more stable Amenhotep III, effectively wiping the entire problematic Amarna period from the official record. This practice of rewriting history shows the deep anxiety that surrounded succession. A pharaoh's legitimacy was not always guaranteed by birthright. It had to be actively constructed and defended. They had to build monuments, win battles, and create a powerful narrative that justified their place on the throne. For a king like Horemheb, who came to power through a coup, this was a full-time job. He had to constantly prove that his rule was the will of the gods, that he was the one who had restored Ma'at after a period of chaos. His entire reign was an exercise in demonstrating his worthiness for a job that he was never born to have, a performance designed to quell any doubts about his right to wear the double crown. This brings us back to the central theme: performance. Being pharaoh was less about a state of being and more about a continuous, exhausting act. They were acting the part of a god for their people, the part of a wealthy benefactor for their allies, the part of an infallible judge for their subjects, and the part of a legitimate heir for the history books. Every word they spoke, every gesture they made, was part of this grand, public performance. And like any actor, they must have lived with the constant fear of slipping up, of forgetting a line, of letting the mask slip, and revealing the fragile, flawed, and often frightened human being underneath. The terror of the job was rooted in the impossible standard they were expected to meet, a standard of divine perfection that no mortal could ever hope to achieve. This pressure was even more intense during times of crisis. When faced with a famine, an epidemic, or a foreign invasion, the pharaoh could not appear worried or uncertain. They had to be the calm, unwavering center of the storm, the rock upon which the entire nation depended. When the Sea Peoples bore down on Egypt during the reign of Ramesses III, it was an existential threat. These invaders had already toppled the mighty Hittite Empire and other great powers. Egypt was the last one standing. Ramesses had to rally his army and his people, projecting an image of absolute confidence and divine favor, even as he faced one of the greatest military threats in Egypt's long history. The psychological burden of leadership in a moment like that is almost impossible to comprehend. And when they won, they had to commemorate that victory on a monumental scale. The walls of Ramesses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu are covered in vast reliefs celebrating his victory over the Sea Peoples. They show the pharaoh as a towering figure, single-handedly destroying his enemies, while his own army seems almost incidental. This wasn't just egotistical boasting. It was a necessary piece of political and religious theater. It was a message to the people of Egypt and to the gods themselves that Ma'at had been successfully defended against the forces of chaos, and that their king had proven himself to be the worthy and powerful protector he was supposed to be. The victory wasn't real, in a cosmic sense, until it had been recorded in stone for all eternity. Let's pause on that image for a moment. A king, who we know was destined to be murdered by his own family, standing in his magnificent temple, surrounded by images of his own superhuman invincibility. This single contrast encapsulates the terrifying reality of being pharaoh better than anything else. The public image was one of absolute power, divine protection, and eternal victory. The private reality was one of constant vulnerability, hidden dangers, and the inescapable frailties of being human. They were trapped between the myth they were forced to create and the much more frightening reality they were forced to live. The true story of the pharaohs is the story of the immense, crushing gap between those two worlds. This need to project a flawless image extended far beyond the battlefield or the temple walls. It permeated every aspect of their lives, even their own bodies. The pharaoh's body was not considered private property. It was a sacred vessel, a national symbol. Its health and appearance were matters of state. This led to a strange and demanding set of responsibilities related to their physical representation. The official art of ancient Egypt was not meant to be a realistic portrait of the king. It was a carefully constructed theological statement. The pharaoh had to be shown as eternally young, healthy, and athletic, the perfect human specimen, because this physical perfection was a visual metaphor for the health and stability of the entire kingdom. This is why the art style of Akhenaten's reign was so shocking to his people. By choosing to be depicted with a sagging belly and elongated, strange limbs, he was shattering one of the most fundamental conventions of royal imagery. He was presenting an image of strangeness and imperfection that broke with 1,000 years of tradition. For his subjects, this would have been visually jarring and deeply unsettling. It was another way in which he was seen to be disrupting the natural order of things. When Tutankhamun came to the throne, one of the first things his advisors did was to revert to the traditional, idealized artistic style. They put the mask of divine perfection back on, restoring the comforting, familiar image of the flawless king. But this created a profound disconnect between the official image and the living reality. We know from his mummy that Tutankhamun was disabled and had a club foot. Yet none of his thousands of statues or reliefs show this. He is always depicted as a perfect, able-bodied young man. This means that every time he appeared in public, walking with his cane, his people would have seen the stark difference between the idealized king of the temple walls and the actual, physically challenged boy before them. This must have created a strange cognitive dissonance for both the king and his subjects. He was forced to live as a constant, walking contradiction to his own official propaganda, a living reminder of the gap between the divine ideal and the human reality. This obsession with a perfect physical image also meant that the signs of aging were a political problem. The pharaoh was supposed to be timeless and eternal. Wrinkles, gray hair, and a stooped posture were all signs of human decay that contradicted the divine myth. While some rare examples of statues showing older kings exist, they are the exception. The vast majority of pharaohs had themselves depicted in a state of permanent, athletic youth from the day they took the throne to the day they died. Ramesses the Great ruled for an incredible 67 years and lived to be over 90, an ancient age in that era. We know from his mummy that he was a frail old man at the end, stooped over with severe arthritis and suffering from circulatory problems. Yet his official statues continue to portray him as the powerful, muscular warrior of his youth. Imagine the sheer effort required to maintain this illusion. As the pharaoh aged and his body began to fail, the gap between his idealized image and his physical reality would have grown wider and more obvious every year. He would have to rely on his courtiers and priests to help him maintain the performance, to literally prop him up during long ceremonies, to hide his infirmities from public view. It was another layer of exhausting pretense, another aspect of his life that was a carefully managed stage play. He was fighting a losing battle against time itself, all because his role demanded that he be seen as a being who was above the normal human process of aging and decay. This pressure to embody a physical ideal also helps explain the importance of certain royal ceremonies, like the said festival. This was an elaborate jubilee, usually celebrated after a king had ruled for 30 years. The central part of the festival involved the pharaoh running a ritual course between markers, a symbolic act designed to demonstrate his continued physical vitality and fitness to rule. For an aging king, this must have been a daunting prospect. It was a public physical fitness test, and failing it, or even appearing weak while performing it, could be interpreted as a sign that his power was waning. The entire ceremony was a piece of magical and political theater designed to show the gods and the people that the king was still vigorous enough to continue his reign, effectively resetting the clock on his rule. This deep connection between the king's body and the body of the state meant that any perceived weakness in one was seen as a weakness in the other. If the pharaoh was ill, the kingdom was ill. If the pharaoh was old and frail, the kingdom was old and frail. This is a heavy burden to place on any individual. Every personal ache and pain, every sign of aging, was not just a private matter, but a potential national crisis. It adds a layer of psychological stress to the simple act of getting older. The pharaoh could never just grow old gracefully. They had to fight it, deny it, and hide it for as long as possible, because their perceived physical strength was directly tied to the stability and prosperity of the entire nation. And when death finally came, the process of preserving this perfect image continued. The goal of mummification was not just to preserve the body, but to transform it into a perfect, eternal, and divine version of itself. The internal organs, which were prone to decay, were removed. The body was dried out with natron salt to stop decomposition. And then it was wrapped in hundreds of yards of linen, with magical amulets placed at key points to protect it. The final step was the placement of a beautiful, idealized portrait mask over the head. The purpose of this entire process was to magically heal the body of all the imperfections, diseases, and injuries it had suffered in life, creating a perfect, divine vessel that the spirit could inhabit for eternity. So even in death, the pharaoh could not escape the responsibility of maintaining the performance. The mummification process was the final act of creating the perfect royal image, an image that would last for millions of years. It was the ultimate attempt to bridge the gap between the flawed human body and the perfect divine ideal. The serene gold masks that we find so beautiful were the final permanent layer of propaganda, designed to hide the realities of a difficult life and a painful death, and to present to the gods a version of the king that was worthy of being reborn among them. It was the last and most important duty they had to perform. Let's bring all these threads together. Being pharaoh was not a single job. It was a dozen impossible jobs rolled into one. You were a high priest, a military commander, a chief executive, a supreme judge, a lead diplomat, and a national symbol. You were held accountable for everything from the weather to the economy to the outcome of court cases. Your body was not your own. Your family was a source of constant danger, and you had no such thing as a private life. You were forced to live your entire existence as a public performance of a divine ideal that no human being could ever possibly live up to. And you did all of this knowing that your every action was being judged not just by your subjects, but by the gods and by history itself. The terrifying responsibility of the job came from the fact that there was no margin for error. In the Egyptian worldview, the default state of the universe was chaos. Order, or ma'at, was a fragile and precious thing that had to be actively maintained every single day. The pharaoh was the single linchpin holding that order together. If they failed in any one of their numerous duties, if they performed a ritual incorrectly, lost a battle, delivered an unjust verdict, or failed to secure the food supply, the entire structure could come crashing down. The stakes were not just political or personal, they were cosmic. A failed pharaoh didn't just risk being overthrown, they risked plunging the entire world back into the darkness from which it was created. This explains the profound conservatism of Egyptian culture. For 3,000 years, the core institutions, religious beliefs, and artistic styles remained remarkably consistent. This wasn't because they lacked imagination. It was because they believed they had found a system that worked, a system that successfully maintained Ma'at. Innovation and change were seen as dangerous because any deviation from the established traditions could potentially disrupt the delicate balance of the cosmos. The pharaoh's job was not to be a reformer or a revolutionary, like Akhenaten tried to be. Their job was to be a conservator, to faithfully perform the duties that had been passed down for generations, to keep the great machine of the universe running smoothly. This makes their achievements all the more remarkable. Despite these crushing pressures, many pharaohs ruled effectively for decades. They built monuments that still inspire awe today. They managed a complex society that was largely stable and prosperous for millennia. And they created a culture of incredible beauty and sophistication. They were able to do this not because they were truly gods, but because they were often incredibly capable, resilient, and hard-working human beings. They rose to the challenge of their impossible job and managed to bear a weight that would have broken most people. They succeeded in their performance, and the longevity of their civilization is a testament to that success. But we should never forget the cost of that success. The price of stability for the nation was an immense personal burden on the individual who wore the crown. For every magnificent temple, there was a pharaoh worrying about the logistics of its construction. For every victorious battle relief, there was a king who had to face the real terror of the battlefield. And for every serene golden death mask, there was a human being who had lived a life of profound stress, isolation, and pain. The story of ancient Egypt is not just a story of gods and gold. It's a story of the terrifying and deeply human responsibility of trying to be a god on earth. This pressure to be more than human, to be the perfect link in an eternal chain, also created a unique relationship between the pharaoh and time itself. They were not just concerned with the present moment. They were simultaneously living in the past and the future. They looked to the past for the traditions and rituals that they had to uphold, constantly measuring themselves against the legendary deeds of their ancestors, like Thutmose III or Ramesses the Great. They were haunted by the ghosts of their great predecessors, driven by the need to equal or surpass their achievements. This created a constant pressure to build bigger, to conquer more, and to leave a legacy that would not be overshadowed by the giants of the past. At the same time, they were forced to look constantly towards the future, a future that was filled with uncertainty. Their greatest responsibility was to produce a male heir and ensure a smooth transition of power. This was not simply a matter of continuing the family line. It was a fundamental requirement for the stability of the cosmos. A king's death without a clear successor was the most dangerous moment for the state, a vacuum that could invite chaos, civil war, and the breakdown of order. Therefore, a huge amount of the pharaoh's energy was spent on a project of human creation, raising a son who was worthy and capable of taking on this impossible job. They were not just a ruler, they were the first and most important teacher for the next guardian of Ma'at. The life of a crown prince was not one of idle luxury. From a young age, he would have been immersed in the machinery of the state and the rituals of the temple. He would have been taught to read and write the complex hieroglyphic script by the best scribes. He would have studied diplomacy, law, and administration under the watchful eye of his father and the vizier. And, crucially, he would have been given military training, learning to drive a chariot, use a bow, and lead troops in mock battles. He was being forged into a perfect copy of his father, a vessel ready to be filled with the divine spirit of kingship when the time came. The pharaoh's responsibility was to ensure that this education was perfect, because any flaw in the prince's training could become a fatal flaw in the next king's reign. To further reduce the risks of a chaotic succession, some of the most successful pharaohs used a clever political tool, the co-regency. An aging king would elevate his chosen son to the throne to rule alongside him as a junior co-pharaoh. This was a brilliant move for several reasons. First, it gave the prince invaluable on-the-job training in a controlled environment. He could learn the ropes of kingship with his father there to guide him and correct his mistakes. Second, it made the succession absolutely clear to everyone in the kingdom, neutralizing any potential rivals who might have been plotting to make a claim after the old king's death. And finally, it created a seamless transition. When the senior king died, the junior king was already on the throne, already recognized as a legitimate ruler. The divine power was never broken. It was simply passed from one hand to the other. This practice shows the deep-seated anxiety that pharaohs felt about the future and the continuity of their lineage. They could not afford to simply hope for the best. They had to actively manage their own succession, treating it as the final and most important project of their reign. For the prince, a co-regency was both a blessing and a burden. He was granted immense power and prestige, but he was also living under the constant scrutiny of his father, the living God, who was also his boss. He had to prove his worthiness every single day, knowing that a single major failure could potentially lead to him being disinherited. The father-son relationship in this context was transformed into a professional relationship between the senior and junior guardians of cosmic order. But what happened when this carefully managed system began to fail? What was the pharaoh's responsibility when the great machine of the state, which they were supposed to control, began to sputter and break down? The later period of the New Kingdom, after the reign of Ramesses III, gives us a grim picture of this terrifying reality. This was a time of growing economic problems, internal division, and a slow erosion of the pharaoh's absolute power. For the kings who ruled during this decline, the primary burden was not one of glorious construction or conquest, but of managing a slow-motion collapse. They were the inheritors of a weakening system, forced to preside over the gradual unraveling of the great civilization they were supposed to protect. One of the most significant challenges was the loss of Egypt's empire. The vast territories in the Levant that had been conquered by great warrior pharaohs like Thutmose III were gradually lost. This had a devastating economic impact. The flow of tribute, gold, silver, timber, and other luxury goods that had enriched Egypt for centuries dried up. This meant the pharaoh had less wealth to fund the army, pay the state workers, and build the magnificent temples that were essential for honoring the gods and demonstrating royal power. The pharaohs of this era, known as the later Ramessides, were kings of a superpower in retreat. They had to maintain the illusion of divine might while dealing with the mundane reality of a shrinking budget and a failing economy. This economic weakness led to a breakdown of order within Egypt itself. As we saw with the tomb robberies, corruption became rampant. But it wasn't just the tombs that were in danger. A famous document from the reign of Ramesses IX, called the, quote, Report of Wenamun, tells the story of an official sent to Lebanon to buy cedar wood for a sacred boat. In centuries past, a representative of the mighty pharaoh would have been treated with the utmost respect. But Wenamun is treated with contempt. The local ruler in Lebanon essentially laughs at him, reminding him that the days when Egypt could command obedience were long gone. Wenamun is robbed, stranded, and humiliated, a perfect symbol of the diminished status of the pharaoh on the world stage. Perhaps the most terrifying development for the pharaohs of this period was the loss of their authority within their own country. For centuries, the king had been the undisputed religious and political leader of all Egypt. But during this decline, a rival power center emerged that grew so strong it eventually eclipsed the throne. This was the priesthood of the god Amun-Ra at Thebes. Enriched by centuries of lavish royal donations, the Temple of Amun had become a vast economic empire in its own right, controlling huge swaths of land, a massive workforce, and its own private army. The high priest of Amun became a figure whose power began to rival, and then surpass, that of the pharaoh himself. The pharaoh, ruling from his capital in the north, became increasingly irrelevant to the affairs of the south, which was effectively controlled by the high priests. Eventually, the high priest Herihor took the final, audacious step. While still technically recognizing the pharaoh in the north, Herihor began to write his own name in a royal cartouche, the oval ring reserved exclusively for the name of a king. He had himself depicted on temple walls, with the same size and stature as the pharaoh. Egypt was now effectively split in two, with a king in the north and a priest-king in the south. For the pharaoh on the throne, this must have been the ultimate humiliation. His divine authority had been successfully challenged, and his kingdom had been fractured from within. He was a god who ruled only half his kingdom. The responsibility of being pharaoh in such a time was a profoundly tragic one. All the old titles and duties remained. They were still the lord of the two lands, even when they only truly controlled one. They were still responsible for maintaining Ma'at for the entire nation, even when half the nation was answering to someone else. They were trapped in a role that demanded absolute power, but they were living in a reality of diminished authority and national division. It was a performance of a role they could no longer fully inhabit, a daily reminder of their own weakness and the slow decay of the institution they represented. The terror was no longer about a single failure. It was about presiding over the systemic failure of their entire world. This long period of decline and division left Egypt vulnerable. The strong, unified kingdom that had once dominated the region was now a tempting prize for ambitious foreign powers. This led to a new and terrifying reality for the person on the throne, the experience of being a conquered pharaoh. For centuries, Egypt had been the conqueror. Now, it was the conquered. First, dynasties of Libyan origin took control, then they were supplanted by a power from the deep south, from the land of Nubia. The pharaohs of the 25th dynasty were Nubian kings, who, after conquering Egypt, faced a unique and paradoxical set of responsibilities. They were foreign rulers who saw themselves as the true saviors of Egyptian culture. The myth we might have is of foreign conquerors imposing their own alien culture on the defeated Egyptians. But the Nubian kings did the exact opposite. They had a deep and long-standing reverence for Egyptian religion and tradition. They saw the divided, chaotic state of Egypt as a perversion of its true glory. So when they conquered the land, they didn't act like foreign occupiers. They presented themselves as restorers, as pious traditionalists who had come to put Egypt back on the correct path. Their primary responsibility, as they saw it, was to purify the kingdom and return it to the glorious ideals of its past. They were outsiders who took on the burden of being more Egyptian than the Egyptians themselves. A king like Paye, the first great ruler of this dynasty, embarked on his conquest of Egypt almost like a religious crusade. His victory stela describes his campaign not as a quest for power, but as a mission to cleanse the temples and punish the petty local rulers who had defiled them. When he conquered a city, his first act was not to plunder it, but to go to the local temple, purify himself, and make offerings to the gods. He was performing the role of the pious pharaoh with more enthusiasm and conviction than the native Egyptian rulers had shown in generations. His responsibility was to prove to the Egyptian people and to their gods that he, a foreigner from Nubia, was the only one who truly understood what it meant to be a proper king of Egypt. This led to a remarkable cultural renaissance. The Nubian pharaohs sponsored a revival of old artistic styles, modeling their statues on the magnificent works of the Old and Middle Kingdoms, 1,000 years in their past. They meticulously restored ancient, dilapidated temples and revived archaic religious texts. They built new pyramids for their burials in their homeland of Nubia, but they did so in a deliberately Egyptian style, the first pyramids to be built for kings in over 800 years. Their entire reign was a conscious and deliberate effort to turn back the clock, to erase the messy and decadent recent past and reconnect with a purer, more powerful and more traditional form of Egyptian civilization. Imagine the immense pressure on a king like Taharqa, one of the most powerful of this dynasty. He was a foreigner, ruling a proud and ancient people. To be accepted, he couldn't just rule, he had to excel. He had to be a better administrator, a more successful warrior, and a more devout priest than any of his native rivals. He was in a constant state of proving his legitimacy, not through his bloodline, but through his actions. He was an incredibly active builder, with his name appearing on monuments from the Delta in the north all the way down to Nubia in the south. He was trying to physically stamp his legitimacy onto the landscape of Egypt, to show through his works that he was a true and worthy pharaoh. But this Nubian restoration was ultimately doomed. A new, terrifyingly brutal power was rising in the east, the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians invaded Egypt, and Taharqa was forced to fight a desperate, losing battle against their technologically superior and ruthless army. He was eventually driven out of Egypt and forced to retreat back to his Nubian homeland. His responsibility became one of tragic defeat. He was the king who had tried to restore the glory of Egypt, only to preside over its brutal conquest by one of the most feared military machines of the ancient world. He ended his life as a king in exile, his dream of a renewed Egypt shattered. His story is a poignant example of a pharaoh who took on the traditional burdens with incredible sincerity, only to be crushed by external forces beyond his control. After the Assyrians came the Persians, then the Greeks. The age of the native Egyptian pharaoh was largely over. For the next several centuries, the person wearing the double crown was a foreign emperor, ruling from a distant capital. But this long period of foreign domination ended with one last, brilliant, and ultimately tragic dynasty of pharaohs, the Ptolemies. They were a Greek Macedonian family, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals. They ruled Egypt for 300 years, and while they were ethnically Greek, they presented themselves to the Egyptian people as traditional pharaohs. They built magnificent new temples in the classical Egyptian style, had their names written in hieroglyphs, and depicted themselves on temple walls making offerings to the Egyptian gods. The Ptolemaic pharaohs lived a strange double life. In their new capital city of Alexandria, they lived like Greek kings. They spoke Greek, sponsored Greek learning and literature in the great library, and presented themselves to the Mediterranean world as sophisticated Hellenistic monarchs. But when they traveled up the Nile into the Egyptian heartland, they put on the costume of the pharaoh. They were chameleons, skillfully navigating two very different cultures. Their responsibility was a complex act of political and cultural translation. They had to be Greek enough to command respect in the wider world, but Egyptian enough to be accepted as legitimate divine rulers by their subjects. It was a balancing act that their dynasty managed successfully for centuries. But by the time we get to the final ruler of this dynasty, the entire game had changed. The world was no longer a collection of roughly equal kingdoms. A new, unstoppable superpower was rising in the West, a power that would dwarf all others, Rome. For the last pharaoh of Egypt, the primary responsibility was no longer about maintaining cosmic order or upholding ancient traditions. It was about pure political survival in the face of this new global power. The final pharaoh had to play a desperate, high-stakes game of diplomacy and war, not against rival kings, but against the relentless expansion of the Roman Republic. The name of this final pharaoh, of course, was Cleopatra VII. The myth of Cleopatra is that of a beautiful, seductive temptress who used her charms to manipulate powerful Roman men like Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. She is often seen as an exotic, decadent queen, a symbol of the mysterious and alluring East. This popular image, largely created by her Roman enemies, does her a profound disservice. It strips her of her agency and intelligence, reducing her to a one-dimensional caricature. The reality is that she was one of the most formidable and capable rulers of her time. She was a brilliant strategist, a skilled diplomat, and a ruthless politician who was fluent in multiple languages, including, uniquely for her dynasty, the Egyptian language itself. She wasn't just a seductress, she was a pharaoh fighting for her kingdom's life. When Cleopatra came to the throne, Egypt was already a client state of Rome. It was technically independent, but its wealth and strategic location meant that Rome was constantly meddling in its internal affairs. The Ptolemaic dynasty was weak and plagued by the same kind of family infighting that had troubled the pharaohs of old. Cleopatra herself had to fight a brutal civil war against her own brother to secure her throne. Her primary responsibility was to navigate this incredibly dangerous political landscape. She knew that a direct military confrontation with Rome was impossible. Her only hope was to play the game of Roman politics. to form personal alliances with the most powerful men in Rome and use their power to protect her own kingdom's independence. Her famous relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were not, therefore, simple love affairs. They were calculated political alliances. By aligning herself with Caesar, she secured his military support to defeat her brother and place her firmly on the throne. With him, she had a son, Caesarion, whom she declared her co-ruler. This was a brilliant dynastic move, an attempt to link her own Ptolemaic lineage with the future of Rome's most powerful man. Her goal was to create a new kind of Greco-Roman Egyptian empire, ruled from Alexandria by her and her son. It was an audacious vision for a new world order, with her at its center. After Caesar was assassinated, Cleopatra was left in a perilous position. She had to find a new Roman protector, and she found one in Mark Antony, Caesar's charismatic general and heir apparent. Their alliance was both political and genuinely personal. Together, they ruled the eastern half of the Roman world from Alexandria. They presented themselves as a new divine couple, Antony as the god Dionysus and Cleopatra as the goddess Isis. This was a powerful piece of propaganda designed to win the loyalty of the eastern provinces. For a brief period, it seemed her gamble might pay off. She was at the height of her power, ruling as a true queen over a vast eastern empire, with the backing of a Roman army. But this alliance placed her in direct opposition to the other great power in Rome, Caesar's ruthlessly efficient adopted son, Octavian. Octavian, the future Emperor Augustus, was a master of propaganda. He portrayed Antony as a weak, decadent Roman who had been bewitched and corrupted by the foreign queen. He painted Cleopatra as a grave threat to the Roman way of life, an ambitious Eastern monarch who wanted to conquer Rome and rule the world from Alexandria. He skillfully turned the Roman civil war between himself and Antony into a patriotic war between Rome and Egypt, between the virtuous West and the corrupt East. Cleopatra became the villain in a story that Octavian was writing for the history books. The inevitable conflict came at the naval Battle of Actium. The forces of Antony and Cleopatra were decisively defeated by Octavian's fleet. The couple fled back to Egypt, but they knew the end was near. Octavian pursued them, and as his legions closed in on Alexandria, Antony took his own life. Cleopatra, left with no allies and no hope of victory, was taken prisoner. Octavian intended to take her back to Rome and parade her through the streets in his victory procession, the ultimate humiliation for a conquered monarch, but Cleopatra would not allow it. She understood the power of performance, the final responsibility of a pharaoh. Better than anyone, she had to control her own ending. In her final act, Cleopatra orchestrated a death that was as carefully staged as any ceremony of her ancestors. According to the traditional story, she had a poisonous snake, an asp, smuggled to her in a basket of figs. The asp was a symbol of Egyptian royalty, a creature associated with the goddess Isis. By choosing this method of death, she was not simply committing suicide. She was performing a final religious ritual. She was transforming her death from a humiliating defeat into a divine apotheosis, an act of becoming a goddess. She dressed in her finest royal robes, lay down on a golden couch, and met her end not as a Roman prisoner, but as the last pharaoh of Egypt, the living Isis, rejoining the gods on her own terms. With her death, 3,000 years of pharaonic rule came to an end. Egypt became a Roman province, its immense wealth now flowing directly into the coffers of the Roman emperors. Octavian, now the Emperor Augustus, was careful to present himself to the Egyptians as the new pharaoh, but this was a pure fiction. He ruled from Rome, and for him and his successors, Egypt was not a sacred kingdom to be protected, but a personal estate to be exploited, the breadbasket of their empire. The divine contract was broken. The link between the king and the cosmos, the central pillar of Egyptian civilization for millennia, was shattered forever. The terrifying responsibilities of the pharaoh ceased to exist because the pharaoh itself had ceased to exist. Looking back across this vast expanse of time, from the early kings who built the pyramids to the final queen who defied an empire, a clear pattern emerges. The pop culture image of the pharaoh as a lazy, all-powerful ruler living a life of unimaginable luxury is a complete fantasy. It mistakes the magnificent stage for the grueling performance. The reality was a job of crushing, relentless, and terrifying responsibility. It was a role that demanded the impossible from the human beings who were chosen to fill it. They were expected to be gods, but they were burdened with all the weaknesses and anxieties of being mortal. The true burden of the pharaoh was the burden of the intermediary. They were the single bridge between the human and divine worlds, between order and chaos, between the people and the gods. And a bridge is a structure that is under constant tension from both sides. They were pulled upwards by the divine expectations of perfection, and pulled downwards by the messy, practical realities of ruling a complex human society. They lived their entire lives on this narrow, precarious bridge, knowing that if they faltered, if they made a single misstep, everything on both sides could collapse into the abyss. This constant, unbearable tension was the defining feature of their existence. We've seen how this pressure manifested in every aspect of their lives. The Nile's flood was their annual performance review by the gods. The concept of ma'at was a demand for constant, active perfection in every decision. Their religious duties were a never-ending cycle of repetitive rituals. Their military role forced them into mortal danger on the battlefield. Their family life was a web of conspiracy and betrayal. Their health was a state secret, their aging a political crisis, and their death was not an end, but the beginning of their most important and dangerous mission. Every single day was a test, and the price of failure was cosmic catastrophe. This perspective helps us understand the ancient Egyptians in a deeper way. Their obsession with tradition, their elaborate funerary cult, their monumental architecture, these were not the products of a strange and morbid culture. They were the logical responses to a worldview that placed an impossible burden on a single individual. The entire machinery of the state, religion, and culture was designed to support the pharaoh in their impossible task. The temples were the tools for communicating with the gods. The bureaucracy was the tool for maintaining economic order. The tombs were the launch pads for the afterlife. Everything was part of a massive, collaborative effort to help the king succeed, because everyone understood that their own survival depended on it. And yet, for all this support, the responsibility ultimately rested on one person's shoulders. We see in the stories of individuals like Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and Cleopatra that the system was only as strong as the person at its center. Hatshepsut had to bend the rules of gender to make the system work for her. Akhenaten tried to break the system entirely, with catastrophic results. Tutankhamun was a weak link, a child used by others to repair the damage. And Cleopatra was the final, brilliant guardian of a system that was being crushed by a new world order. Each of their stories is a case study in the different ways a pharaoh could try to manage or fail to manage the terrifying responsibilities of their office. So the next time you see a golden pharaonic mask or a colossal statue, try to imagine the person behind the icon. Don't see a distant, godlike figure. See a human being who woke up every morning with the weight of the world on their shoulders. A person who had to worry about the harvest, the loyalty of their generals, a painful toothache, the mood of the crocodile god, and the construction of their own tomb, all at the same time. See the profound loneliness of their position, the exhaustion of the constant performance, and the terror of knowing that the fate of millions, both living and dead, depended on them getting it right. The glamour of the pharaohs is an illusion. Their true story is one of duty, burden, and a lifelong struggle against chaos. They were not living a dream. They were trapped in one, a beautiful and terrifying dream from which there was no escape except death. And even then, their work was not done. The responsibility followed them into the darkness of the tomb and beyond. To be a pharaoh was not to be given the greatest prize in the ancient world. It was to be handed the heaviest burden imaginable, a burden that was, in every sense of the word, truly terrifying. It's easy for us, in our modern world, to separate our leaders from cosmic events. We don't blame a president for a drought or a prime minister for a flood. We see these as natural events, outside of human control. But for the Egyptians, that separation did not exist. Nature, politics, and religion were all woven together into a single fabric, and the pharaoh was the central thread holding it all together. This complete fusion of responsibility is what makes their role so alien and so fascinating to us. They had no one else to blame. The buck, both literally and cosmically, always stopped with them. This burden was also deeply generational. A pharaoh inherited not only the successes but also the failures of their predecessors. Tutankhamun inherited the religious chaos of his father, Akhenaten. The later Ramesside kings inherited a shrinking empire and a failing economy. Each new king was handed a set of problems that were not of their own making, but which they were now divinely responsible for solving. They were constantly trying to patch up the cracks in a structure that was thousands of years old, all while trying to build something that would last for their own descendants. It was a job that was never finished, a relay race where the baton was the fate of the world. We also see that the nature of the terror could change over time. For an old kingdom pharaoh like Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid, the terror was primarily logistical and spiritual. How to organize a massive workforce, and how to ensure the tomb machine would function correctly. For a new kingdom warrior like Thutmose III, the terror was military and imperial, how to conquer and manage a vast, multi-ethnic empire. For a late-period pharaoh like the Harka, the terror was nationalistic, how to restore a lost glory in the face of foreign invasion. And for Cleopatra, the terror was geopolitical, how to preserve her kingdom from being swallowed by a global superpower. The title remained the same, but the core challenges evolved. What never evolved, however, was the fundamental expectation of success. No matter the circumstances, no matter how weak their position or how powerful their enemies, the pharaoh was always expected to win. They were expected to be victorious, prosperous, and divinely favored. The ideology of kingship had no room for honorable failure or graceful defeat. This is why official records are so often filled with propaganda. A military defeat might be spun as a strategic retreat, or simply not mentioned at all. A period of famine would be glossed over. The official image always had to be one of success, because to admit failure was to admit a crack in the cosmic order, a weakness in the pharaoh's connection to the gods. This created an immense pressure to lie, or at least to creatively edit the truth. The famous Battle of Kadesh, where Ramesses the Great was nearly defeated by the Hittites, is a perfect example. The peace treaty that ended the war was essentially a draw, with both sides respecting each other's sphere of influence. But if you look at the temple walls in Egypt, Ramesses portrayed the battle as a stunning, single-handed victory, with himself as a superhero who single-handedly routed the entire Hittite army. This wasn't just ego, it was a political necessity. He had to present the outcome to his people as a glorious triumph, because the alternative, admitting that the living god had almost been killed and his army nearly destroyed, was simply unthinkable. So we can add chief propagandist to the long list of the pharaoh's jobs. They were in a constant campaign to sell their own success story to their people. Their monuments were their billboards, their inscriptions, their press releases. This was not just about personal vanity. It was a core function of the state. Maintaining public confidence in the king's divine effectiveness was essential for maintaining social order. If the people began to believe that the pharaoh was weak or had lost the favor of the gods, the entire system could begin to unravel. The performance of power was, in many ways, just as important as the actual exercise of power. This brings us to a final, subtle terror, the terror of belief. Did they actually believe it all? Did a pharaoh like Ramesses II, in the quiet moments of the night, truly believe he was the physical son of the god Amun-Ra? Or did he understand that this was a necessary political fiction? This is a question we can never truly answer, as it lies in the silent space of a mind from 3,000 years ago. But we can imagine the immense psychological complexity of their position. They were raised from birth to believe in their own divinity, surrounded by people who treated them as a god. And yet, they experienced pain, fear, doubt, and sickness just like any mortal. To live with that contradiction every day must have been a unique form of mental anguish. To be told you are a god, and to feel the very human fear on the eve of a battle. To be worshipped as the source of all life, and to feel the agony of a broken bone. To be told you are eternal, and to watch your own body age and decay in the mirror. This internal conflict between the divine role and the human reality may have been the most terrifying responsibility of all. They were the only person in the kingdom who knew for a fact that the living God was also a frail and fallible human being. And that was a secret they had to carry with them, alone, every single day of their lives. This burden of knowledge is perhaps best exemplified by their relationship with magic. The Egyptians believed deeply in the power of magic, or, quote, Heka, as a fundamental force in the universe that the gods used to create the world. The pharaoh, as a divine being, was supposed to be the greatest magician of all. The rituals he performed were not just symbolic, they were seen as powerful magical acts that actively maintained the cosmos. He was expected to be a master of this unseen, powerful force. But magic was a double-edged sword. The same spells and rituals that could be used to protect Egypt could also be used to harm the king, as we saw in the harem conspiracy against Ramesses III. So the pharaoh lived in a world that was not only politically dangerous, but also magically dangerous. They had to be constantly on guard, not just against assassins with daggers, but against sorcerers with wax figures and curses. They would have surrounded themselves with protective amulets and recited magical spells for their own safety every day. This adds a layer of supernatural paranoia to their already stressful lives. Every political rival was a potential magical threat. Every illness could be interpreted as a magical attack. It was a world where the lines between the physical and the supernatural were blurred, and the pharaoh was the primary target in both realms. This constant threat, both seen and unseen, helps to explain the profound isolation of the pharaoh's position. They were at the absolute pinnacle of their society, so far above everyone else that they were essentially in a different category of being. But this elevation came at the cost of genuine human connection. It is difficult to have a true friend when everyone around you sees you as their god. It is difficult to trust a family member when they might see you as an obstacle to the throne. This isolation, this inability to ever truly lower their guard, was the price of their divinity. They ruled over millions, but they were ultimately and terrifyingly alone. And yet, despite all these pressures, the institution of the pharaoh endured for 3,000 years, one of the most stable and long-lasting forms of government in human history. This is the ultimate paradox. The job was impossible, the responsibilities terrifying, and the personal cost immense. But for century after century, someone stepped up to take on the burden. The system worked. It created a civilization of incredible resilience, creativity, and power. The performance, no matter how grueling, was so convincing that it became the reality. The belief in the divine king, shared by the ruler and his people, was strong enough to hold a civilization together through thick and thin. Perhaps the final responsibility, then, was simply to endure, to get up every morning, put on the heavy crown, and face another day of impossible demands. To perform the rituals, lead the armies, sign the decrees, and maintain the mask of serene divinity, no matter what personal turmoil or national crisis was raging behind the scenes. The pharaoh's job was to be the constant, the unchanging pole star in the sky of their people's lives. They had to be the one thing that was always there, always stable, always perfect, they had to absorb all the chaos and anxiety of the world so that their people could live in a state of perceived order. This changes our understanding of what their power was for. We tend to think of power as a tool for personal gratification, a way to get what you want. But for the pharaoh, power was not a privilege. It was a tool for fulfilling a duty. The immense wealth and authority they commanded were not for their own enjoyment. They were the resources required to perform their cosmic function. The gold was needed to plate the shrines of the gods. The armies were needed to defend the borders of Ma'at. The absolute authority was needed to enforce justice. Power, for them, was not an end in itself. It was the heavy, cumbersome equipment that came with the job. So let's discard the romantic myth of the pharaoh once and for all. Let's replace the image of a god-king lounging on a throne with the image of a chief executive on the verge of burnout. Let's see the Great Pyramid not just as a wonder of the world, but as the product of a king's profound anxiety about his final exam. Let's see the golden mask of Tutankhamun not as a symbol of wealth, but as the beautiful, serene lie that was used to hide the painful reality of a disabled boy who was handed a broken kingdom. The truth is far more complex, far more human, and far more interesting than the myth. The story of the pharaohs is not a fairy tale of divine power. It is a cautionary tale about the weight of responsibility. It is a story of human beings grappling with a superhuman job description and the extraordinary lengths they had to go to simply to keep their world from falling apart. Theirs was a gilded cage, a golden prison of duty and ritual. And perhaps the most terrifying part of it all was that they were not just the prisoners. They were also the jailers, forced to uphold the very system that demanded so much of them. It was a cycle of burden, passed down from father to son for 100 generations, until the very last queen chose her own end rather than see it broken by another's hand. This long, unbroken chain of responsibility meant that the very concept of personal freedom was alien to the pharaoh. From birth, their life was not their own. It was a path laid out for them by 2,000 years of tradition, a script they were expected to follow without deviation. Every choice, from who they married to what they ate, was dictated by ritual and political necessity. They were the least free person in their own kingdom, a divine slave to the crown they wore. While their subjects might dream of power and wealth, the pharaoh might have dreamed of the simple, anonymous freedom of a common farmer, a life where a bad harvest was just a personal tragedy, not a cosmic failure. And what happened when the people began to lose faith in this central figure? As the central government weakened in the later New Kingdom, we see a fascinating shift in the religious life of the common Egyptian. For centuries, the official model was that the pharaoh was the main conduit to the gods. An ordinary person would appeal to a local priest, who would appeal to a higher priest, who was theoretically acting as a stand-in for the king. But as the pharaoh's power and prestige waned, people began to seek a more direct relationship with the divine. This was a quiet, grassroots religious revolution, born out of the perceived failure of the person at the top. This new personal piety, as scholars call it, is evident in the prayers and inscriptions of the time. People began to address gods like Amun or Thoth directly as personal saviors, as divine judges who could intervene in their daily lives. They would leave inscriptions at temples describing their personal troubles, an illness, a legal dispute, and their prayers for help. They would confess their sins directly to the god, seeking forgiveness. The god was becoming a personal protector, a role that was once the exclusive domain of the pharaoh. This shift suggests that the people, seeing the chaos in the world around them, had begun to lose faith in the king's ability to maintain Ma'at, and so they took matters into their own hands, seeking divine help for themselves. This must have been a terrifying development for the pharaoh. The core of their authority was the belief that they were the essential intermediary. When people started going around them, appealing directly to the gods, it was a sign that this core belief was eroding. It was a vote of no confidence on a spiritual level. The king was still performing the great state rituals in the massive temples, but on the ground, his subjects were building a new kind of relationship with the gods, one that didn't require a king at all. The pharaoh was becoming spiritually obsolete, a figurehead presiding over a religion that was leaving him behind. This was a quiet, internal threat that was perhaps more dangerous than any foreign army. So the terrifying responsibilities of the pharaoh were not just about action, but about perception. They had to maintain the belief in their own necessity. When that belief began to fade, their power faded with it. The late period pharaohs were not just struggling with economic and military problems. They were struggling with a crisis of faith in the very institution of kingship. They were trying to command the respect of a people who were increasingly looking elsewhere for their salvation. It was the final, slow-motion failure of the great performance, as the audience quietly began to lose interest and find new heroes in the heavens. After the Roman conquest, the role of the pharaoh effectively ended. But what happened to their legacy? What happened to the memories of these kings who had spent their entire lives so obsessed with being remembered for eternity? For a few centuries, their culture continued in a blended form. But with the rise of Christianity and later Islam, the old religion was suppressed. The temples were closed, the ancient language of hieroglyphs was forgotten, and the names of the great kings who had built them faded from human memory. For over 1,000 years, the pharaohs failed in their final great responsibility. They were almost completely forgotten. The pyramids stood silent in the desert, their purpose a mystery. The inscriptions on the temple walls were now just incomprehensible pictures. The great rediscovery of ancient Egypt began in the 19th century, sparked by Napoleon's invasion and the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which provided the key to deciphering the hieroglyphs. Suddenly, the silent monuments began to speak again. The names of Thutmose, Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, and Ramesses were read for the first time in millennia. A new breed of explorer, the archaeologist, began to descend on Egypt, digging into the sands and uncovering the lost world of the pharaohs. They were not priests seeking to honor the dead kings, but scholars and adventurers seeking knowledge and treasure. They brought the pharaohs back into the light, but in a way the ancient kings could never have imagined. This brings us to one of the most famous and misunderstood parts of the pharaoh's legacy, the myth of the mummy's curse. The popular story is that the ancient Egyptians placed powerful curses on their tombs to protect them from anyone who would disturb their rest, and that these curses brought madness, ruin, and death to the archaeologists who dared to enter. This idea exploded into a global phenomenon after the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. The expedition's financial backer, Lord Carnarvon, died from an infected mosquito bite a few months after the tomb was opened, and sensationalist newspapers around the world immediately declared it was the curse of the pharaoh. The story was too good to let the facts get in the way. The reality is that there is no evidence of any ancient Egyptian curse in the way we think of it. While some tombs contain protective inscriptions, these were generally warnings aimed at deterring ancient tomb robbers, promising divine punishment in the afterlife rather than a supernatural attack in this one. The so-called Curse of Tutankhamun was a media invention. A study of the people who were present when the tomb was opened found that they lived, on average, to a perfectly normal old age. The lead archaeologist, Howard Carter, who was the first person to enter the burial chamber, lived for another 17 years, dying at the age of 64. The curse was a modern myth, a spooky story we told ourselves because we wanted the ancient world to be as mysterious and dangerous as it looked. But in a way, there was a curse associated with the pharaohs, it just wasn't the one we think of. The true curse was not some magical hex placed upon their tombs. The true curse was the job itself. It was the curse of being born into a role that demanded divine perfection from a mortal body. It was the curse of living a life of profound isolation, where every human connection was a potential political risk. It was the curse of carrying the weight of the cosmos on your shoulders, of being blamed for every drought, famine, and military defeat. And it was the curse of spending your entire life preparing for a death that you hoped would be the start of a glorious eternity, only for your body to be violated by thieves, or, perhaps even worse, put on display in a museum for the curiosity of strangers. This, then, is the ultimate irony of the pharaoh's story. They dedicated immense resources and performed endless rituals, all for the sake of securing a perfect, undisturbed afterlife. Yet their final fate was to have their sacred tombs systematically dismantled and their divine bodies unwrapped, studied, and exhibited. The very act that made them famous to us, the archaeological discovery of their remains, was a complete violation of everything they had worked for. The great Ramesses, who had fought so hard to create an eternal legacy of power, became specimen number CG 61078 in the Egyptian Museum. This was the final, unexpected failure of their responsibility, a fate they could never have foreseen. And yet, in another sense, they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Their ultimate goal was to be remembered, to have their names live forever. And they have. The names of Khufu, Hatshepsut, Tutankhamun, and Cleopatra are more famous today than they ever were in the ancient world. Millions of people every year travel to see their monuments and look upon their treasures. They have achieved a kind of immortality, just not the one they had planned for. They are no longer worshipped as gods, but they are remembered as kings, their stories told and retold thousands of years after their civilization has turned to dust. In this one crucial way, their lifelong struggle to defeat oblivion was a stunning success. So as we draw our journey to a close, we are left with this complex, contradictory image. The pharaoh was at once one of the most powerful and one of the most burdened individuals in human history. Their life was a tapestry, woven with threads of divine splendor and deep human suffering. They were worshipped as gods, but they died like mortals. They commanded millions, but were profoundly alone. They built for eternity, only to have their tombs broken into and their bodies displayed. Their story is a powerful lesson in the nature of power, the weight of duty, and the incredible resilience of the human spirit in the face of impossible demands. The responsibility of the pharaoh was, in the end, a responsibility to maintain a story. The story was that the universe is orderly, that the gods are pleased, that Egypt is eternal, and that the king is the divine guarantor of it all. This story was told in stone, in papyrus, in ritual, and in art. It was a beautiful and comforting story, but it was a fragile one. The pharaoh's job was to be the main character and the lead narrator of this national epic, to live inside the story so completely that it became real for everyone. The terror was that they were the only one who knew it was just a story, and that they had to spend their entire life making sure no one else ever found out. Think of the sheer mental discipline required for this. To preside over a famine, knowing your people are starving, while commissioning a temple relief that shows you presenting a harvest of abundance to the gods. To return from a battle that was a bloody stalemate, and then to oversee the carving of an inscription that describes it as a world-changing victory. This was not simple hypocrisy. It was a fundamental part of the job. They had to project the ideal reality in order to magically bring it into being. The performance was not a lie. It was a cosmic tool, a way of imposing the desired order onto a messy and chaotic world. But the gap between the world as it was and the world as it was supposed to be was a space of immense psychological stress, and the pharaoh lived there every day. This perspective also helps us understand the moments when the system broke, like with Akhenaten. His great crime was not just changing the religion. His crime was that he stopped telling the old story and tried to introduce a new one that nobody was ready for. He broke the narrative contract. He replaced a story that was thousands of years old, a story that everyone understood, with a strange and personal story that only he seemed to comprehend. And the entire system collapsed into chaos as a result. His reign is the ultimate proof of how important that shared story was, and how dangerous it was for the storyteller to go off script. We can also see this responsibility in their names. A pharaoh's royal name was not a simple label. It was a mission statement, a summary of the story they intended to tell with their reign. A name like Nebmatre, the throne name of Amenhotep III, means the Lord of Truth is Ra. This was a promise to uphold Ma'at and rule with divine justice. A name like Uzamatre Setepenre, the name of Ramesses II, means the justice of Ra is powerful, chosen of Ra. This was a declaration of his divine backing and his military might. From the moment they took the throne, they were bound by the promises embedded in their own names, another daily reminder of the impossibly high standard they were expected to meet. And what of the women who shared this world? The great royal wife had her own set of terrifying responsibilities. She was not just the king's consort, she was his divine counterpart, the earthly embodiment of a goddess like Isis or Hathor. Her primary duty was to produce the next heir, but she was also a crucial participant in religious rituals and a powerful political figure in her own right. She lived in the same gilded cage as her husband, her life also a constant performance of a divine role. And as we saw with the story of Hatshepsut, some of these women were more than capable of taking on the main role themselves when the opportunity arose. The lives of the royal children were also defined by this system of burden. They were raised in the cloistered environment of the palace, their childhoods a long apprenticeship for a future of immense responsibility or relative obscurity. A prince lived with the constant pressure to prove himself worthy of the throne, knowing that his brothers were his rivals. A princess knew that her destiny was likely to be a political marriage, either to her own brother to consolidate the royal bloodline, or to a foreign king to seal an alliance. There was no room for personal choice. Their lives were assets of the state, their futures determined by the needs of the crown. This entire structure, so focused on a single divine individual, seems incredibly risky from our modern perspective. We build systems of government with checks and balances, designed to be resilient and not dependent on the health or competence of one person. The Egyptian system was the exact opposite. It was deliberately designed to concentrate all responsibility, both practical and spiritual, into a single point of failure, the pharaoh. That it worked for so long is a testament to the incredible power of the ideology that supported it. The belief in the divine king was the glue that held their entire civilization together for 3 millennia. But when that glue began to dissolve, the collapse was inevitable. The late period of Egyptian history, with its internal divisions and foreign invasions, is the story of that slow dissolution. The pharaohs of that era were like actors on a grand stage, playing their parts with conviction, but the theater itself was slowly falling apart around them. The audience was losing faith, the props were breaking, and the script no longer seemed to match the reality of the world outside. They were the final guardians of a dying dream, a dream of a perfect, ordered world ruled by a perfect, divine king. Ultimately, the story of the pharaoh's responsibilities is a story about the human need for meaning and order in a chaotic universe. The Egyptians created a system that gave them a sense of control over the unpredictable forces of nature. They created a story that made sense of their world, a story in which a powerful and benevolent king acted as their champion and protector, standing between them and the darkness. The terrifying burden of the pharaoh was that they had to be the living embodiment of that story, the one person who could not afford to show any doubt or fear. They had to be the anchor for their entire culture's sense of security. So as we leave them to their eternal rest, let's try to see them not as they were depicted on the temple walls, as invincible, godlike beings. Let's see them as they truly were, human beings, given a superhuman task. Think of the young Tutankhamun, struggling to walk with his cane, being dressed in heavy golden robes for another ceremony he barely understands. Think of Ramesses III, celebrating a great military victory, with no idea that the deadliest threat he would ever face was sleeping in his own palace. Think of Cleopatra, the brilliant scholar and politician, making a final, desperate gamble to save her kingdom from the inevitable. Their story is not one of distant, unrelatable power. It's a story of pressure, of anxiety, of pain, and of duty. It's a story of the incredible things that people can achieve when they are driven by a profound sense of responsibility. But it is also a story of the terrible personal cost of that responsibility. The gold and the glamour were real, but they were the compensation for a life that most of us would find unbearable. They were the beautiful, shining surface of a reality that was defined by a constant, terrifying struggle. The romantic image of the pharaoh is an easy one to hold on to because it's simple and beautiful, but the reality is far more compelling. It reminds us that behind every great monument, behind every powerful throne, there is a human story. A story of ambition, yes, but also of fear. A story of glory, but also of sacrifice. The pharaohs of Egypt were not gods. They were people, and their true legacy is not the gold they left behind, but the enduring story of their struggle to carry the heaviest crown in human history. We began this journey with a simple image, a king on a golden throne, a figure of absolute and easy power. We now see that this image is a carefully constructed fantasy, a piece of ancient propaganda that is still working its magic on us today. The reality was a daily grind of ritual, administration, and existential dread. The throne was not a comfortable seat of luxury. It was the epicenter of every political, military, and spiritual crisis in the kingdom. It was the loneliest and most stressful place in ancient Egypt. The pharaoh's responsibility was to be the perfect man in an imperfect world. They had to be the still point in the turning world, the unshakable foundation in an age of uncertainty. They were a living sacrifice, their personal freedom and happiness offered up on the altar of cosmic stability. Every decision they made was weighed not just for its political consequences, but for its impact on the delicate balance of the universe. It was a job application that might as well have read, "Wanted, guardian of all creation. Must be perfect, no days off. The fate of the world is in your hands. Good luck." This immense pressure also explains their obsession with their own legacy. Building massive tombs and temples was not just an act of ego. It was an attempt to create something solid and permanent in a life that was filled with uncertainty and pressure. It was a way of saying, "I was here. I did my duty. I held the line against chaos." Their monuments are not just symbols of their power. They are symbols of their anxiety, their desperate hope that their grueling performance in this life would be rewarded with peace and glory in the next. So the terrifying responsibility of being pharaoh was not a single thing. It was 1,000 things, all at once. It was the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future. It was the demands of the gods and the needs of the people. It was the threat of foreign enemies and the danger of treacherous family. It was the perfection of the divine image and the painful reality of the mortal body. It was a constant, lifelong juggling act, where dropping a single ball could mean the end of everything. The story of the pharaohs serves as a powerful reminder that the true nature of leadership is not about privilege, but about burden. The higher the position, the heavier the weight, and there has never been a higher position or a heavier weight than that which rested upon the person who wore the double crown of ancient Egypt. Theirs was a singular experience in human history, a unique fusion of the sacred and the profane, the divine and the deeply, painfully human. Let's consider for a final moment the sheer physical toll, the endless days of standing in ceremonies, wearing heavy crowns and thick robes in the Egyptian heat, the jarring rides in chariots over rough terrain during military campaigns, the long hours spent listening to legal cases and dictating letters to scribes, the constant travel up and down the Nile to inspect building projects and attend festivals. It was a physically demanding job, on top of all the mental and spiritual stress. The fact that many of them lived to old age is a testament to their incredible physical and mental fortitude. We can also imagine the sensory overload, the constant sound of priests chanting, courtiers whispering, and petitioners pleading. The overwhelming smell of incense in the temples, mingled with the smell of oils, perfumes, and the press of unwashed bodies in the court. The sight of endless rows of columns, brightly painted reliefs, and the dazzling glare of the sun on golden objects. Their entire life was a heightened sensory experience, a world without silence, privacy, or subtlety. There was no escape from the constant performance and the stage on which it was set. This intense public life also meant that their emotions were a matter of state. A pharaoh could not afford to show anger, fear, or grief in a way that might be perceived as weakness. They had to maintain a mask of divine calm and serenity at all times. When a beloved wife or child died, the king would have to lead the mourning rituals for the nation, his personal grief subsumed into a public performance of royal sorrow. Even in their most human moments, they were never allowed to be just human. Their emotions belonged to the state, just like everything else. This incredible system of belief was so powerful that it even shaped how they viewed the landscape itself. The Nile was not just a river, it was a god. The desert was not just sand, it was the realm of chaos. The sky was not just the sky, it was the body of the goddess Nut. The pharaoh lived in a world that was alive with divine meaning, where every natural phenomenon was a message from the gods. This made the world a deeply meaningful place to live, but it also made it a place of constant anxiety. A sandstorm was not just bad weather, it was an attack by the forces of chaos that the king was responsible for defeating. And so, the pharaoh was the central character in a grand cosmic drama that was playing out every day. They were the hero, the forces of chaos were the villain, and the entire nation of Egypt was the prize. Their life was the script, and every action they took was a line in the play. This is perhaps the best way to understand their role. They were not just kings or priests. They were the lead actors in the longest-running play in human history, a play that lasted for 3,000 years. And the terrifying responsibility was that they could never break character. This is why their stories continue to fascinate us. They represent an extreme version of a struggle that is a part of every human life. The struggle between who we are and who we are expected to be. The gap between our private selves and our public personas. The pharaohs simply lived out this struggle on the grandest, most high-stakes stage imaginable. Their story is our story, magnified to a divine and epic scale. It is the timeless story of the burden of expectation. Let's not pity them. They were, in many cases, ruthless rulers who commanded immense power and lived in a state of wealth that is difficult to comprehend. But let's not envy them either. Theirs was not a life of ease. It was a life of profound and unrelenting service to an idea, the idea of Ma'at. They were the servants of their own divinity, the prisoners of their own prestige. The gold was the compensation, not the prize. The prize was the hope of a peaceful eternity, something most of them were denied. The final image that should stay with us is one of profound duality. The pharaoh was both a man and a god. He was both a ruler and a servant. He was both a conqueror and a prisoner. He was both the most powerful person in his world and the one with the least amount of personal freedom. It is in this contradiction, in this constant tension between the human and the divine, that the true story of their terrifying responsibility lies. So the next time you hear the word pharaoh, try to look past the golden shimmer. Think of the calloused hands of the soldier king, the tired eyes of the chief administrator, the worried mind of the high priest. Think of the human being at the heart of the divine myth, the person who had to carry the weight of a civilization that believed its very existence depended on their every breath, every action, every prayer. The terrifying responsibility of being an Egyptian pharaoh was, quite simply, the responsibility of being everything to everyone, all the time. It was to be the sun that warmed the land, the river that fed the people, the bull that protected the borders, and the father that judged with perfect wisdom. It was an impossible, superhuman ideal. And the most remarkable thing is not that some of them failed, but that for 3,000 years, so many of them managed to convince the world, and perhaps even themselves, that they were succeeding. This entire system was a magnificent, collective act of will, a civilization-wide agreement to believe in an idea so powerful that it shaped reality. The pharaoh was the living focus of that belief, the vessel into which an entire culture poured its hopes and fears. Their burden was to carry the weight of all those hopes and fears, to absorb them, and to reflect back an image of calm, eternal order. It was the greatest performance of leadership in human history. We see the remnants of this performance in the ruins that line the Nile today. The temples at Karnak and Luxor, the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, the pyramids at Giza. These are not just ancient buildings. They are the fossilized evidence of this incredible system of belief and responsibility. They are monuments to the pressure that the pharaohs were under. They are the beautiful, silent witnesses to the terrifying weight of the crown. The story of the pharaohs did not end with the death of Cleopatra. It continues in our own fascination, in our museums, in our books, and in our films. They succeeded in achieving a form of immortality they never intended. Their legacy is a powerful reminder of a time when the world was understood very differently, when a single human being could be asked to hold the universe in balance. And it is a testament to the fact that even the most powerful person on earth can be a prisoner to their own job description. So, the pop culture image of the pharaoh is not wrong because it is glamorous. It is wrong because it is simple. It strips away the complexity, the anxiety, and the profound human drama of their position. It gives us the golden mask, but it hides the worried face beneath. The truth is infinitely more compelling, a story of mortal men and women tasked with the daily, terrifying responsibility of pretending to be gods. And in the end, that is the most human story of all, the story of waking up each day to face a set of expectations that feel impossibly high, the story of putting on a brave face for the world, even when you are struggling, the story of trying to create order in a world that is often chaotic. The pharaohs just did it on a scale and with a set of stakes that we can barely imagine. Their world was different, but their struggle was timeless. The true curse of the pharaohs was not a magical spell that would strike down those who disturbed their sleep. The true curse was the one they lived with every day of their lives. It was the curse of divine responsibility, a burden so heavy it could break a person, and a role so demanding it could consume a soul. They were born into this curse, and they could not escape it, not even in death. Let's leave them there, in the quiet of their hidden tombs in the halls of our museums. Let's look at their serene, golden faces with a new kind of understanding, not with the simple awe of looking at a king's treasure, but with the quiet empathy of recognizing the immense burden that lay behind the beautiful facade. They were not just kings, they were the guardians of a dream, and that is a terrifying thing to be. The final, witty truth about being a pharaoh is that it was the ultimate high-pressure job with an eternal employment contract, but the retirement plan was incredibly hazardous. The entire point of the job was to get to the afterlife in one piece, yet almost none of them did. It was a cosmic paradox, a divine game that seems, in the end, to have been rigged against the player from the very start. So as the light fades and you settle into sleep, perhaps think of them one last time. Not as the golden icons of a lost world, but as the tired managers of a cosmic enterprise, finally, at the end of a very long, very difficult shift. Their story is a powerful reminder that even the most glittering crowns are, in the end, incredibly heavy. The story of the pharaohs, in the end, is not about the power they held, but about the weight they carried. And the most remarkable thing is that for 3,000 years, they carried it with such grace that they convinced the world they were flying. The gold was just the packaging for a life of service and fear, and perhaps the greatest and most terrifying responsibility of all was simply making it look so easy.